Hey there, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Uncle Grunkle, and this is the kind of channel where you can settle in, get comfortable, and let someone else do the thinking for a while. Tonight, we're doing something a little special. We're going to sink deep into one of the most quietly extraordinary animated shows ever made. A show that looked, on the surface, like a light little cartoon for kids about a couple of twins spending the summer in a weird Oregon town. And underneath that surface was something else entirely. Something layered. Something patient. Something that was always thinking about you, the viewer, far more carefully than you ever expected a cartoon to do. We're talking about Gravity Falls, and we are going to take our time with it tonight. There's no rush. Wherever you are right now, whether you're in bed with the lights off, lying on a couch with a blanket pulled up around you, or just somewhere quiet with your headphones in, I want you to feel the weight of this one slowly settle around you like those tall pines settling into fog. Because the lore of Gravity Falls is the kind of thing that rewards patience. The more slowly you move through it, the more it reveals. And tonight, we're going to move very, very slowly. So get comfortable, take a breath, close your eyes if you want to. And let's go back to the summer of 2012. Let's go back to the beginning. Gravity Falls premiered on June 15th, 2012 on the Disney Channel. Most people who tuned in for that first episode probably expected something perfectly pleasant and forgettable. A funny little show about some kids getting into supernatural misadventures. Or maybe a Monster of the Week format. A few good jokes. Some light adventure. And the first episode, Tourist Trapped, did deliver exactly that on the surface. 12-year-old Dipper Pines and his twin sister Mabel are dropped off for the summer at their great-uncle Stan's tourist trap in a small, sleepy Oregon town called Gravity Falls. Dipper finds a mysterious journal in the woods. Mabel falls for a boy who turns out to be a garden gnome controlling a monster made of other garden gnomes. It's funny, it's charming, it's fast-paced and warm and clever. You could watch it and feel perfectly satisfied and move on with your evening. But Alex Hirsch had already hidden things. He had hidden things in the first scene, in the first frame, in the first second of the opening theme song. And that's what we're going to spend tonight unpacking, but very slowly, from the very beginning, all the way through to the last goodbye at the edge of summer. Because Gravity Falls is a show that doesn't just tell you a story, it invites you into one. It hides pieces of itself in corners you never thought to look, look. And it waits. It trusts that someday you'll come back and find them. Alex Hirsch was born on June 18th, 1985 in Piedmont, California. He grew up with his twin sister Ariel, and between the ages of roughly 9 and 13, he and Ariel would spend their summers at their great-aunt Lois's cabin in the woods. Not a cabin in Gravity Falls, obviously, since that town doesn't exist, but a real cabin in real woods, somewhere out there in the world where things felt a little more mysterious than they did back home. Those summers are the heartbeat of Gravity Falls. Hirsch has talked about what it felt like to be that particular kind of kid, the kind who carried 16 disposable cameras everywhere, who would record his own voice and play it backwards just to hear what it sounded like, who was overwhelmingly convinced that something strange was happening just beyond the edges of what adults were willing to look at. He was, in his own words, a neurotic kid. And that neurotic kid grew up to put himself and his sister into a cartoon that would go on to mean an enormous amount to an enormous number of people. Dipper Pines is Alex Hirsch as a 12-year-old. The anxiety, the overactive brain, the desperate need to understand things, the birthmark on his forehead shaped like the Big Dipper constellation and that he hides under the brim of his cap because being different feels like something to conceal. All of that came from something real. And Mabel Pines, that blazing whirlwind of sequined sweaters and goofy optimism and genuine, unguarded joy, she came from Ariel. Hirsch has said that his sister really did wear wacky sweaters and really did have a new ridiculous crush every week. The pet pig was something she always wanted. The infectious laughter and the total refusal to let the world be less than magical, that was real too. And Grunkle Stan, the grumpy, lovable con man in the fez who overcharges tourists and sleeps on the couch, he came from Hirsch's grandfather, also named Stan, who would mess around with the kids and try to keep them entertained. 3 real people, one real summer feeling, filtered through a very particular, very deliberate imagination. That is where Gravity Falls came from. But Hirsch didn't stop at personal experience. He was also drawing from a tradition. He grew up on the X-Files and on tabloid newspapers, those wonderful, strange publications that existed in the 90s and early 2000s that claimed breathlessly that Bigfoot was real and that Elvis had been spotted at a Waffle House in Tulsa. He loved Twin Peaks, which was a show about a strange small town in the Pacific Northwest where the surface of things concealed something far weirder and darker underneath. He loved Erie, Indiana, which was a short-lived early 90s show about a kid who moves to a town where nothing is quite right and only he seems to notice. These influences all went into the mix. What came out was a show about childhood and mysteries and family and the cost of secrets, wrapped in the aesthetic of an old-fashioned adventure cartoon and hidden inside a Disney Channel time slot where nobody expected anything that deep to be lurking. That contrast between what the show appeared to be and what it actually was entirely intentional. It was the whole point. And the very first piece of evidence for that was there from the very beginning, before the first episode even properly started, in the opening theme song itself. If you are just drifting off right now and you want to pause and tell us where you're watching from, please do. Drop a comment below with your time and your place. It genuinely makes this community feel like something real, like a campfire that people are gathered around from different corners of the world. We love reading them, and while you're down there, if this channel gives you even a little piece, a subscription helps more than you know. It keeps the lights on. It means we can keep making these long, slow dives into the things we love. All right, now let's get into the codes. Section 2. The Opening Secrets. Codes hidden in plain sight. Diggs. The Gravity Falls opening theme is 45 seconds of pure atmosphere. It opens on those pine trees, tall and dense and slightly too dark, swaying in a wind you can practically feel through the screen. There's a shot of a waterfall. There are quick flashes of things, strange things. A gnome, a creature in the water, a blurred figure that might be Bigfoot moving through the trees. The music is this wonderful mix of banjo and mystery, something playful on top and something unnerving underneath. And then right at the very end of the theme, before the title card appears, there's a single frame, a cryptogram, a string of scrambled letters that flash for less than a second. So quickly that most casual viewers never even register it. Their brains just file it away as visual noise and move on. But it wasn't noise. The very first cryptogram to appear in the Gravity Falls opening, right there in Episode 1, Tourist Trapped, reads VWDQLVQRDZIKDWKHVHHPV, which probably looks completely meaningless, until you know what cipher to apply. It's a Caesar cipher, named after Julius Caesar, who used this method to encode military correspondence 2,000 years ago. A Caesar cipher works by shifting each letter a set number of positions through the alphabet. In Gravity Falls, the shift is 3. So you take each letter and move it back 3 positions. V becomes S, W becomes T, D becomes A, Q becomes N. And when you decode the whole string of letters, you get Stan is not what he seems. Think about what that means. From the very first episode, before you know anything about Stan's past, before you know anything about the portal beneath the Mystery Shack, before you have any reason to suspect that this apparently simple con man in a fez is anything other than what he appears to be, the show is already telling you, right there in the opening credits, hiding it in plain sight inside a code that most viewers would never think to decode or wouldn't know how. Stan is not what he seems. That message is a prophecy. It doesn't fully pay off until the 11th episode of Season 2, which is literally titled Not What He Seems. So that's over a year of real time between the hidden message and the moment it comes true. Alex Hirsch planted that seed in the soil of Episode 1 and watered it for 15 months. But here's where it gets even more layered. Because not only did Hirsch hide the message in the opening credits, he also hid the key to decoding it in the opening theme itself. If you listen very carefully to the Gravity Falls theme, right at the moment when Bill Cipher's wheel flashes briefly on screen, there is a tiny whispered audio cue hidden in the music. It is almost inaudible on a first listen, buried under the melody. But if you isolate that whisper and play it backwards, it says 3 letters back. That is the Caesar cipher key, 3 letters back. Hirsch literally embedded the solution to his own puzzle inside the puzzle itself. Now, he hid the answer inside the question, and then he hid both of them in the opening credits of a children's cartoon and waited to see who would find them. And people did find them. The Gravity Falls fan community during the show's original run became one of the most obsessively engaged audiences in the history of animation. There were forums dedicated entirely to decoding the end-of-episode cryptograms. There were spreadsheets tracking every message across every episode. There were fan wikis that documented every decoded line with careful attention to what it might mean, what it was foreshadowing, what new piece of the mythology it was quietly revealing. This was not a passive audience. This was a community of detectives. And as the show progressed through its first season, Alex Hirsch rewarded that community by making things progressively harder. The Caesar cipher was used for the first 6 episodes. Simple enough to crack once you knew to look. The end credits message from episode 1 decoded to "Welcome to Gravity Falls." Episode 2 gave you next week "Return to Butt Island," which was funny and silly and just weird enough to confirm that yes, these messages were intentional, and yes, whoever was writing them had a sense of humor. Episode 3, "He's Still in the Vents," a callback to Wax Larry King's decapitated head crawling around in the Mystery Shack's ductwork after the events of that episode's plot. Episode 4, "Carla, Why Won't You Call Me?" A genuinely baffling personal aside that seemed to be an in-joke from the writing room. Episode 5, "Onwards Aoshima," which referenced a character from that week's story. These early messages were playful, witty little asides, but they were sai. They were also training the audience, teaching them to look, encouraging the habit of attention that would later pay off in much more significant ways. Then came episode 6, "Dipper versus Manliness," and the end credits message shifted. It read, "Mr. Caesarian will be out next week. Mr. Atbash will substitute." Which, once decoded with the Caesar cipher still in use for that episode, was the show itself announcing a change in the cipher system. Starting with episode 7, the cryptograms would use the Atbash cipher instead. The Atbash cipher works by mirroring the entire alphabet. A becomes Z, B becomes Y, C becomes X, Z becomes A, Y becomes B, and so on. You reverse the whole thing. The hint to this change was already embedded in the theme song, where the backward whisper now said "Switch A with Z," telling you exactly how to adapt your decoding method. From episode 7 through episode 13, the Atbash cipher was in use. The messages continued to be a mix of funny, strange, and occasionally genuinely eerie. One decoded message from this period reads, "Paper Jam Dipper says, which is pure absurdist comedy." Another from this same stretch reads, "Sorry, Dap. Dipper but your Wendy is in another castle," a reference to the Mario Brothers games that is both funny and quietly a little heartbreaking given Dipper's unrequited feelings for Wendy throughout the series. But not all of them were jokes. The tone shifted as the season progressed. Some of the decoded messages started to feel more pointed, more aware, like the show looking at you over its shoulder. Then came episode 14 and another shift. The backward whisper in the theme changed to 26 letters, announcing the adoption of the A1Z26 cipher. This one converts each letter of the alphabet to its corresponding number. A equals 1, B equals 2, Z equals 26. The messages became strings of numbers that you had to translate back to letters. Slightly more tedious, but still perfectly solvable, and the theme itself was still handing you the key. Episodes 14 through 19 used this system. And then episode 20, Gideon Rises, the season 1 finale, used a combined cipher. 3 systems layered on top of each other. A1Z26 first, then Atbash, then Caesar. It required applying all 3 decoding steps in sequence to get the final message, which served as both a technical challenge and a symbolic gesture. Things were getting complicated. The first season was ending, and the mysteries were deepening, and the codes were getting harder to crack, all in lockstep. Season 2 arrived with the most sophisticated cipher system yet, the Vigenère cipher. This one was named after the 16th century French diplomat Blaise de Vigenère, who developed it as a significantly harder-to-crack method of encoding. A Vigenère cipher is essentially a series of Caesar ciphers run in sequence, where each letter in the message uses a different shift determined by a keyword. To decode a Vigenère message, you need to know the keyword. Without it, the message is essentially unbreakable by brute force for most practical purposes. The backward whisper in the Season 2 opening changed to Key Visionaire, and the keywords themselves were hidden within each episode, encoded separately, requiring a second layer of decoding before you could even begin on the main message. This was Hirsch escalating the sophistication of his game in perfect sync with the escalation of the show's own narrative complexity. As the story got darker and more intricate, so did the puzzles. As the stakes got higher, so did the difficulty. But here's the thing that makes all of this genuinely remarkable. Beyond just being a clever gimmick, these weren't throwaway puzzles. The messages weren't always silly. Some of them were devastating. A string of messages decoded from the numbers Cipher used across episodes 14 through 19 when compiled and combined in sequence. Red, I was so blind. He lied to me. The darkness is near. That is Ford. Writing in code as paranoia overtook him, as he began to understand what Bill Cipher really was and what he had been manipulated into building. That message had been sitting in those episodes, waiting to be found, the entire time. And there's another piece of the opening theme that deserves attention, separate from the ciphers entirely. In the opening credits, there is a brief flash of a circular diagram. It appears for perhaps a single frame, maybe two, and it is filled with symbols arranged in a ring. A pine tree, a shooting star, a pair of glasses with no lens, a six-fingered hand, a question mark, a llama, an ice bag, a pair of glasses, a heart, a pentagram, a crescent moon. These symbols form the outer ring of the circle, thus surrounding a central triangle with a single blazing eye. That triangle is Bill Cipher, and those symbols around him are not random. Each one represents a specific character in the show. The pine tree is Dipper. The shooting star is Mabel. The glasses are McGucket. The six-fingered hand is Ford. The question mark represents Seuss. The llama is Pacifica Northwest. The ice bag is Gideon. This diagram, which becomes known to fans as the Bill Cipher wheel or the Zodiac, doesn't become narratively important until the series finale. In the finale, it is revealed to be part of an ancient prophecy, a method for defeating Bill Cipher that requires all of the people represented by those symbols to join hands in a circle and channel their power together. The wheel has been in the opening credits from episode 1. Every single person who would eventually face Bill Cipher in the final battle was already shown in that wheel, arranged around him, before most of them had even been introduced in the story. Hirsch planned the whole thing. The ending was encoded into the beginning. The wheel in the opening credits was always a map to where the story was going, visible the whole time, right there in front of the audience. Most people who watched the show in real time only understood what the wheel meant after the finale aired. When they went back and looked at the opening credits again, it was right there. It had always been right there. And that retroactive understanding, that feeling of catching up to something the show already knew, is one of the things that makes Gravity Falls so rewatchable and so quietly unsettling on a second viewing. Now, the show knew how it was going to end before it began. It left you the map. You just didn't know you were looking at it. There are other things in the opening, too. The figure glimpsed moving through the pine trees in the background of the credits, just barely visible, just enough to make you wonder. If you freeze it at the right moment, it's a creature. A specific creature. One that appears much later in the show in a much more significant context. Hirsch put it in the opening because he trusted that someday someone would notice. And they did. Someone always did. In the background of various scenes across the first season, in the set dressing of buildings and walls and public spaces throughout Gravity Falls, there is a symbol that appears again and again. It's a drawing of an eye with an X through it. Most first-time viewers ignore it completely. It's just wallpaper, it's just texture, it's just part of the scenery. But that symbol belongs to the Society of the Blind Eye, a secret organization that doesn't get revealed until Season 2, Episode 7. Hirsch was putting their symbol in the background of the show from almost the very beginning. He was hiding them in plain sight, trusting that the audience would eventually look back and say, "Wait, I've seen that before. I've been seeing that the whole time. And I never knew what it meant." There are tiny glowing eyes visible in the trees in the very first episode, in the scene where Dipper finds Journal 3. They are barely there, just faint glimmers among the foliage, easy to miss entirely. but they are deliberate. Something was watching Dipper from the moment he found that journal. The show never explicitly draws your attention to those eyes. It doesn't need to. They're there for the viewers who look closely enough, and they imply something that will only become clear much later. Bill Cipher was present from the very beginning, not just as a myth, not just as a distant threat. Present, watching, already interested. This is what I mean when I say the show rewards obsessive attention in ways that most television doesn't attempt. Every frame was considered. Every background detail was a potential message. Every piece of set dressing might mean something. The show treated its audience as active participants rather than passive viewers, and it invited everyone who wanted to play along into a game that lasted for the entire run of the series and beyond. The number 618 appears throughout the show, on stamps, on signs, on various objects in the background. It's Hirsch's birthday, June 18th. He put it everywhere like a painter, signing their work in hidden corners of the canvas. Once you start looking for it, you see it all the time. And once you start looking for it, you start looking for everything else too. That is the genius of the opening and of the show's approach to hiding information in general. It doesn't just reward the people who decode the ciphers. It rewards a general habit of attention. It teaches you to look more carefully at everything. And once you've been trained to look that way at Gravity Falls, you start looking that way at other things too. That is not an accident. Alex Hirsch has said as much in interviews. The show was meant to make its audience more curious, more skeptical, more likely to ask questions, more likely to look behind the obvious answer for what might be hiding underneath. That's not just entertainment, that is a gift. But we've only been looking at the outside of the show so far. We've been looking at the frame and the margin notes and the locked box in the corner. Now it's time to open the journal itself. Now it's time to talk about what Ford Pines found when he first came to Gravity Falls and what he wrote down and what he hid, and why he was so frightened at the end that he scattered the pieces of his life's work across 3 separate journals and buried them in 3 separate places, and sent a strangled, coded message to the one person in the world he still trusted, even though he hadn't spoken to that person in nearly a decade. Section 3. The Journals and the Mystery of the Author. There are 3 of them. 3 journals, each with the same embossed cover. A 6-fingered hand reaching outward against a dark background. Each volume is numbered, 1 through 3, though the numbers aren't in sequence with the order in which they were written. They were written 1, 2, 3 in that order, but they were scattered in reverse. Journal 3 is the one that Dipper finds in the first episode, hidden in a hollow metal compartment beneath the root system of a tree in the forest. Journal 2 ends up in the possession of a preteen con artist named Gideon Gleeful, who uses it as a power tool for his own ambitions. Journal 1 stays with Stan, locked away in the basement behind the vending machine entrance to the secret underground laboratory, right next to the interdimensional portal that Stan has been quietly, patiently working to reactivate for 30 years. Each journal contains research. Ford's research. Pages and pages of careful, meticulous, hand-drawn observations about the supernatural phenomena of Gravity Falls. Entries on gnomes with detailed anatomical diagrams and notes on their behavior and social structure. Entries on the shapeshifter locked in the bunker, the creature that can become anything it has ever seen. Entries on the memory gun that McGucket invented, written in invisible ink that only appears under a blacklight because Ford was writing it in secret, afraid that Bill could somehow see what he was putting down on paper. Entries on the Society of the Blind Eye, written with a mixture of clinical precision and something that reads very much like grief. If my suspicions are correct, this is the work of Fiddleford. Does he really have to go to such great lengths to forget? Pages that have been burned and torn and damaged, casualties of the time the journals spent underground, and of all the things that happened to them before they ended up in the right hands. And there are other pages, too. Pages written in Bill's cipher, his personal symbol substitution code, which he apparently used to hide messages and taunting notes to Ford inside the journals themselves. Because the relationship between Bill and Ford was like that. A long, slow, psychological game played across years, with Ford increasingly paranoid and Bill consistently cheerful about it. The real-world version of Journal 3, published in July 2016 by Disney and written by Alex Hirsch and supervising producer Rob Renzetti, it became a #1 New York Times bestseller. It stayed on the bestseller list for 47 weeks. That alone tells you something about the appetite people had for more of what the show was doing. The book is a 288-page full-color reproduction of Journal 3, including all the pages seen on the show, plus entirely new pages with new information, new monster entries, new context for Ford's backstory, and new layers of hidden material. There's a special edition version with invisible ink pages that only reveal themselves under a blacklight, loose photographs and notes that fall out like physical artifacts when you open the cover, parchment paper that feels old and real, and each copy personally signed by Hirsch, Judd, who reportedly spent 3 full days signing all of them before the release and slipped a disc in the process and ended up in the hospital. He signed every copy anyway. The book contains multiple cipher systems working simultaneously. Some messages are encoded in Bill's personal symbol cipher. Some are in standard ATBASH or A1Z26. Some are visible under blacklight. Hirsch has stated in commentary that there are still codes in the book that he has never seen anyone solve. There may be things hidden in those pages that still haven't been found. There may be messages sitting in corners of that book, waiting for the right pair of eyes, more than 8 years after the book came out. That is the kind of creator Alex Hirsch is. That is what Gravity Falls is at its core. But let's talk about the journals from Ford's perspective, right, from the inside of the mythology. Because understanding what they contain and understanding the story of how they came to be is essential to understanding everything that follows. The journals are the record of a mind at work. They are simultaneously a scientific document, a cautionary tale, and a chronicle of escalating terror. When Ford first started writing in Journal 1, he was excited. He was a young man with a doctorate and a $100,000 research grant, and the conviction that Gravity Falls, Oregon, was the most anomalously supernatural place on the entire planet, and he was going to document everything he found there for the benefit of humanity. The early pages of the journals reflect that excitement. The entries are enthusiastic. The drawings are careful and full of wonder. Something about the writing, in those early pages, has the quality of a child seeing the world as bigger and stranger than expected and being genuinely delighted by it. The gnomes were one of his first significant discoveries. The underground society of gnomes operating beneath Gravity Falls, hundreds of them working in organized colonies, capable of forming themselves into human-shaped giants when the need arose. Ford documented them thoroughly. He noted their hierarchy, their obsession with collecting shiny objects, their peculiar reverence for human females, which plays directly into the events of the show's very first episode when a gnome colony attempts to trick Mabel into becoming their queen. Ford had already encountered this phenomenon years earlier and written about it in careful detail. Dipper's discovery of Journal 3 gave him a roadmap to solving the gnome problem in that first episode, without understanding any of the larger context of who had written the book or why or what would eventually come of it. The shapeshifter was another early discovery, one that warranted its own bunker. A creature that Ford described as one of the most dangerous things he had ever encountered in Gravity Falls, not because of brute physical power, though that was significant, but because of its ability to become absolutely anything it had ever observed. It could become you. It could become the people you loved. It could walk into your house wearing your brother's face and you would never know. Ford built a containment bunker specifically for it, locked it in an isolation cell, and never stopped thinking about it. But the entry in Journal 3 on the shapeshifter is written in a tone that is different from most of the others. It's quieter, more careful. Ford sounds afraid, and Ford doesn't sound afraid very often in the journals. But the shapeshifter got to him, and it shows. There are entries in Journal 3 on creatures that only appear briefly in the show, background monsters in the deep lore of Gravity Falls that get a paragraph or two and then don't come up again but feel fully realized as part of the world. The Gremlin, a small grotesque creature whose eyes cause anyone who looks into them to hallucinate their worst nightmares. It was one of the things that first pushed McGucket over the edge, one of the first encounters that drove him to the memory gun. The Multi-Bear, a gentle giant living in a cave in the mountains who loves classic pop music and just wants to be left alone. The Hide Behind, a creature so fast and so quiet that it is never actually seen, only heard, existing at the edge of vision, always just out of sight. The Gyphon, the Sasquatch, the Platypus, dozens of creatures cataloged with care and scientific precision, by a man who was simultaneously exhilarated and increasingly aware that what he had found here was not just fascinating but actively dangerous. And then there's the entry on Bill Cipher. Ford's entry on Bill in Journal 3 is one of the most interesting pieces of writing in the entire Gravity Falls mythology, because it was written at two different times. The first layer of the entry is from early in Ford's research before he fully understood what Bill was. And in that layer, Ford describes Bill in terms that are almost worshipful. Bill Cipher, he writes, has proven himself to be one of the friendliest and most trustworthy individuals that I've ever encountered in my life. He describes Bill as a muse, a source of insight, a genuinely remarkable entity who shares knowledge freely and asks for very little in return. The writing in this section is warm and slightly odd, the writing of a man who believes he has found a genuine friend, a collaborator, a kindred spirit, in a town where he has been professionally and personally isolated for years. And then the second layer of writing, added later, after everything had changed, after Ford finally understood the truth. Notes written in a different ink, in a slightly more desperate handwriting, like going back over the earlier entries and correcting them, and warning anyone who might find this journal what Bill really was. The contrast between those two layers of writing in the Bill entry is one of the most quietly heartbreaking things in the show. You can trace the arc of a betrayal just in the texture of the handwriting. The early entries, wonder. The later entries, fear. The scrawled warnings in the margins, don't trust him. Don't listen to him. Don't make deals with him. Whatever he offers you, say no. Whatever he tells you about yourself, whatever he promises, however right he seems to be about everything, say no. The journals were meant to help. Ford designed them to be useful to whoever found them, so that the people of Gravity Falls would have the resources they needed to understand and survive the supernatural weirdness of the town. But he also hid them. He scattered them deliberately because he was afraid of what would happen if all three ended up in the same place. All three journals together contained enough information to reactivate the portal beneath the Mystery Shack. And the portal was the thing Ford was most afraid of. Because the portal was the reason Bill had befriended him in the first place. And Ford had figured that out only after it was too late. The Book of Bill, published in August 2024, takes the mythology even further. Written from Bill's perspective, it is simultaneously a companion to the show's lore and a deeply unreliable narrator's account of events that we already know some version of. But Bill has his own version of everything, his own explanation for why he destroyed his home dimension, his own framing of his relationship with Ford, his own charismatic, unsettling commentary on the events of the series. The book reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list immediately upon release. As of early 2025, it had sold over 850,000 copies worldwide. It remains on bestseller lists. People are still hungry for more of this story, nearly a decade after the show ended. Because the story that the show told, the story that the journals contain, is a good one. It's a genuinely good one. And the more you know about it, the better it gets. So let's keep going. Let's talk about who wrote those journals. Let's talk about Stanford Pines. But before we get there, let's linger in the journals just a little longer. That's because there is one more aspect of them worth sitting with. And that is the experience of reading them as a viewer of the show, rather than as a researcher in the world of the show. What does it feel like to encounter these documents from the inside of the fiction? Dipper finds Journal 3 on the very first day of his summer in Gravity Falls. He is hanging signs in the forest, bored and mildly sulky about being sent to spend the summer in a place he has never been, when he steps into a hollow between two tree roots and his foot goes through the ground. Beneath the roots, hidden in a metal compartment built specifically for concealment, is the journal. Red cover, 6-fingered hand embossed in gold. Numbered 3 on the spine. He opens it and reads. And what he reads immediately is a warning. The first page of Journal 3 says, "That in essence, do not trust anyone." The author wrote it in a state of paranoia that had developed steadily over years of living in a place where the supernatural was real and active, and where one specific entity had been actively working to undermine him. But Dipper doesn't have that context yet. To him, on that first day, the warning just reads as atmosphere. as the voice of someone who knew things and thought the knowing was important enough to document. He tucks the journal under his arm and goes back to the Mystery Shack, and his summer begins. What follows, across 20 episodes of Season 1, is Dipper and Mabel using the journal as their field guide to Gravity Falls. Every creature they encounter, almost without exception, has an entry in the journal. Ford had been thorough, terrifyingly thorough, when he documented everything he found with the completeness of someone who believed that the documentation itself could save lives, that the information in those pages was genuinely useful, and that whoever eventually found them would need it. And the entries are not dry academic text. They have personality. Ford had a voice, and that voice is consistent across all three journals, a mixture of intellectual excitement and dry humor, and the occasional detached note that reads as someone managing their own anxiety about what they're looking at. He is clearly fascinated by almost everything he documents. Even the dangerous things, even the things that clearly scared him. The entries on Bill are the exception to this rule, the places where Ford's voice cracks, where the scientist gives way to the man. The journals are, among other things, a record of what it costs to be the kind of person who needs to know everything. Ford needed to know. The needing to know led him to Bill, and Bill led him to the portal, and the portal led him to 30 years of exile. He came back with more knowledge than any human being had ever accumulated about the true nature of dimensional reality. He also came back having missed 30 years of the world he left behind, having missed his brother's slow transformation into someone new, having missed the beginning of everything that the show portrays as the most important thing: family, presence, the specific irreplaceable weight of the people who know you. The journals are worth keeping close in whatever form you have access to them. They are very good company on a quiet night. Section 4. Bill Cipher, the Ancient Dream Demon. Before we get to Ford, we have to get to Bill, because you can't understand Ford's story without understanding what Bill is. And understanding what Bill is requires going somewhere much older and much stranger than the pine forests of Oregon. It requires going back to a place that no longer exists, a place that was destroyed by the very being we're about to discuss over 1 trillion years before the events of the show. 1 trillion years. Let that number sit for a moment. A trillion years ago, the universe we live in was not yet what it currently is. The earliest stars in our cosmos are estimated to be somewhere around 13 to 14 billion years old. The Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old. While 1 trillion years is more than 70 times the age of the Earth. It is an incomprehensible span of time, and Bill Cipher is older than it. Bill Cipher was born or came into being, or perhaps always existed, in a place called the Second Dimension, which the show and its companion materials describe as a flat realm, a world of two-dimensional existence, a place of ideas and shapes rather than depth and mass. And even in that flattened world, even in that simplified plane of existence, Bill was different. He was a triangle, a single eye, a being of pure geometric certainty in a dimension that was built around the idea that 2 dimensions were all anyone needed. We know very little about what Bill's early existence was like. The Book of Bill gives us fragments, but they're filtered through Bill's own highly subjective and deliberately chaotic perspective. What we do know is that he was restless in the second dimension. He found it limiting, confining. He could see outward, could perceive the existence of other dimensions, other realities stacked around his like pages in a book. And he wanted them. He wanted out. He wanted more. He wanted everything. So he destroyed his home. He burned it. He burned the second dimension down to nothing. And in doing so, he killed everyone in it. Everyone he had ever known. His entire civilization. His parents. Everyone. Bill Cipher, in the very first act we know of him, is a parasite and a murderer on an omnicide scale. A being who destroyed an entire universe because he was done with it. And he did it, according to his own account, cheerfully. Yet he called it liberation. He called the destruction of his entire home dimension a freedom. The terminology matters because it reflects something essential about Bill's psychology. He genuinely does not perceive his actions the way other beings do. Destruction is not a cost to him. It is an aesthetic. It is a form of self-expression. After the second dimension was gone, Bill moved into what the show calls the Nightmare Realm, which is also known as Dimension Zero. It is described as a seething, intergalactic foam that exists between dimensions, a lawless space where the rules of physics and logic and consistent reality simply do not apply. Things in the Nightmare Realm change without warning. There is no stable ground. There is no reliable causality. Without fixed laws of nature, the Nightmare Realm is in a state of constant chaos. And Bill moved in and made himself king of it. Not by force necessarily, though force was certainly available to him, but by presence. By the sheer overwhelming fact of him. Other entities in the Nightmare Realm feared him not because they understood what he was, but because the Nightmare Realm operates on belief, and everyone in it believed he was unstoppable. In the Nightmare Realm, Bill was powerful. He could do nearly anything within its borders. He could reshape reality, such as it was. He could peer into the minds of beings in other dimensions, communicate through dreams, whisper ideas into the heads of people who were sleeping or thinking too hard. But he could not touch the physical world directly. He was a dream entity, existing in the mindscape, in the space of thoughts and unconscious processes, visible only as an image, only as a dream, only as a voice that came to you in the night and told you things you wanted to hear. For the beings of the third dimension, the physical universe we inhabit, Bill could only ever be a presence in the mind, a hitchhiker in the imagination. And that limitation was the thing he was determined to overcome. Now, the show tells us that over many thousands of years, Bill attempted to find pathways into the physical world through various human civilizations. Cave paintings found in a cavern beneath Gravity Falls show his symbol, that triangle with the eye, surrounded by ancient warnings written by people who had encountered him and survived and felt the need to leave instructions for anyone who came after. The symbol of Bill Cipher appears in cave art in what would become Gravity Falls, Oregon, long before the town existed, long before there were any European settlers in that part of North America. The indigenous people who lived near that area knew about him. They knew enough to write warnings. They knew that the land was special, that it was a place where the membrane between the physical world and the Nightmare Realm was thin, and they treated it with appropriate caution. Their warnings included instructions. If you find these drawings, do not say the words. Do not read the incantation aloud. Do not invite the entity in. Ford found those drawings. And Ford, because he was a scientist with a scientific mind, and because he had, by that point, been spending weeks in his research lab hitting a wall he couldn't get past, and because he was a man who always needed to know, read the words aloud. But we'll get to that. We're not quite at Ford yet. Let's stay with Bill a little longer. Let's talk about what he actually is and what he wants and why he is in the considered opinion of many people who have spent time thinking about the Gravity Falls villain roster, one of the genuinely great antagonists in the history of animated television. Bill Cipher is drawn in the simplest possible visual language. A yellow equilateral triangle, a top hat, a bow tie, one eye. That's it. He is technically the most minimalist character design in the show, in a show that includes sentient gnomes and shape-shifting monsters and an alien crash site. And yet he is, without question, the most unsettling thing in the show. The minimalism is the point. The simplicity is terrifying because of what it implies. Being old enough to have destroyed his own universe and spent 1 trillion years in the space between realities doesn't need to look complicated. He doesn't need to look threatening. He can look exactly like the image on the back of a dollar bill, all-seeing eye inside a triangle, cheerful and simple and fundamentally wrong. And that wrongness is more frightening than anything elaborate would be. His voice actor, Alex Hirsch, who plays multiple characters in the show, including Grunkle Stan and Seuss, plays Bill in a completely different register than anything else in his range. Bill speaks with a manic, crackling energy. There's laughter threaded through everything he says, not warm laughter, not the laughter of genuine delight, but the laughter of someone who finds the entire universe amusing in the way that a very large creature might find a very small obstacle amusing. Everything is funny to Bill because nothing is serious to Bill. Nothing has consequences for him in a way that would make seriousness appropriate. Hirsch has said that Bill was originally conceived as a one-time character, a villain for a single episode. Not the show's overarching antagonist, Not the force behind everything, just a weird dream demon who showed up in one episode and then went away. But something about what Bill became as a character, the charisma and the unpredictability, and the way he could deliver genuinely funny lines while simultaneously being actively horrifying, made it impossible to leave him as a single-use entity. He grew. His backstory deepened. That his relationship with Ford became the emotional and narrative spine of the entire second season. And the show that started as a light mystery cartoon about kids investigating weird things in a small town ended up being, among other things, a story about what happens when you make a deal with someone who is smarter than you and older than the universe and has absolutely nothing to lose. Bill's abilities in the show are described as being effectively limitless within the mindscape. He can enter dreams. He can take over bodies with the consent of the host. Though his possession leaves physical damage, the eyes bleed when Bill is in residence too long. He can manipulate perception. He can make deals that bind other beings to their word in ways that are binding. He knows things. He knows a great deal about a great many things, and he shares that knowledge strategically, giving out just enough to be invaluable without giving out so much that he becomes unnecessary. In the physical world, before Weirdmageddon, Bill is limited. He can appear as a flaming triangle. He can interact with physical objects to a degree. He cannot do most of the things he does in the mindscape. This limitation is crucial to the plot of the entire series, because everything Bill does throughout the show, every manipulation, every deal, every whispered suggestion in somebody's dreaming mind, is aimed at one goal: getting through, getting out, getting a physical body and a physical presence in the physical world, merging his nightmare realm with the third dimension, doing to the universe what he once did to the second dimension, liberating it. But the word liberation is always the one he uses. As if destruction is just a different kind of freedom. As if the end of everything is just a change in scenery. He is, in the estimation of the show's final season, 1 billion years old in relation to at least one specific prophecy about his eventual attempt to enter the physical world. He is described in his own words as 1,012 years old, which apparently counts as preteen in the dimension he came from. He is older than time itself, or at least older than the time structures we understand. And he has spent virtually all of that incomprehensible lifespan waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right combination of genius and loneliness and pride that would give him the foothold he needed. That combination arrived in the form of Stanford Philbrick Pines, Ph.D., died in the autumn of 1981, in a small town in Oregon. And everything that followed from that moment, every event of the show, every sacrifice and secret and tide, every journal page and portal and memory and loss, traces back to that single meeting between a lonely genius and a dream demon who had been waiting for exactly this kind of person for a very, very long time. Section 5, Stanford Pines, Genius, Obsession, and Betrayal. Stanford Pines was born in the late 1940s or early 1950s, depending on which piece of supplementary material you're going by, in Glass Shard Beach, New Jersey, which is a fictional town but feels completely real. Glass Shard Beach has a specific texture to it. It's the kind of beach town that's a little run down, a little tired. Not the glamorous beaches of vacation posters, but the actual lived-in coast where the sand is gray and there's usually an overcast sky and the buildings lean slightly into the wind from years of it. Glass Shard Beach is where Philbrick Pines ran a pawn shop, where Ford and his younger twin brother Stanley grew up, 15 minutes apart in age but a universe apart in temperament. Ford was born with polydactyly, an extra finger on each hand, 6 fingers total on both, a condition the show treats as genuinely meaningful rather than just a physical quirk. Those extra fingers marked him as different from his earliest childhood. Other kids noticed. Other kids made it a problem. They teased him for his hands and for his intelligence and for the combination of the two, for being the kind of kid who was visibly, unmistakably not like everyone else. And Ford internalized that difference in a particular way. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to minimize it. He leaned into it. He became more himself in response to the rejection, not less. His strangeness was going to be the thing that made him great. He was convinced of that. His IQ was tested early and came back exceptional. His drawings were precise and observant far beyond what should have been possible for his age. His science projects were original and carefully reasoned. The principal of Glass Shard Beach Elementary and then Glass Shard Beach High School took particular notice of Ford and made sure that his teachers knew what they were dealing with. And through all of this, through all the recognition and all the differentness and all the early indications that this kid was going somewhere big, the one constant in Ford's life was his brother Stanley. Stan was not Ford. Stan was funny where Ford was serious, impulsive where Ford was careful, street smart where Ford was book smart. Stan got through high school largely by copying Ford's notes. Stan's grades were not impressive. Stan's prospects were, from a conventional academic standpoint, limited. But Stan was the person Ford trusted absolutely. Stan was the one who stepped in when the bullies came for Ford's six-fingered hands. Stan was the one who found the derelict boat on the beach with the name Stan O'Wars painted on the hull, and who painted over it and renamed it the Stan O'War. Aye, and who made a pact with Ford that someday they were going to sail that boat around the world together and have the kind of adventure that their dead-end beach town never allowed for. Stan and Ford against the world. That was the deal. When Ford was in high school, his science teacher recognized what he was working on, a design for a perpetual motion machine, as genuinely groundbreaking work. He recommended Ford for a prestigious university on the West Coast, referred to in the show as West Coast Tech, clearly modeled on Caltech. The scholarship there represented not just an academic opportunity, but a financial one. Ford's success at West Coast Tech could have meant real money for the Pines family. Proper money. The kind of security that Philbrick had spent his whole life chasing through the pawn shop and never quite reaching. Philbrick was not a gentle man. He was the kind of father who viewed his sons in terms of what they could do for the family, and what they could earn, and what their potential was in purely practical terms. Ford was the investment. Stan was the liability. The night before Ford was scheduled to present his perpetual motion machine at the school science fair, Stan was in the gymnasium. He was brooding. He was watching his brother move toward a future that was going to take him away from Glass Shard Beach, away from their shared dream of the boat and the ocean and the adventure. He was 17 years old, and he was about to lose the only real friend he had ever had. And in a moment of frustration and carelessness that he would spend the rest of his life paying for, he knocked into Ford's perpetual motion machine and damaged it. Whether it was deliberate sabotage or genuine accident has always been slightly ambiguous in the show's telling of events. And Ford believed it was deliberate, and their father believed it was deliberate. And that belief became the truth that shaped everything that followed. The machine malfunctioned. The scholarship offer was withdrawn. Philbrick blamed Stan. In front of both boys, with the weight and finality of a man who had made his decision and was not going to revisit it, Philbrick told Stan to pack his things and get out. He was done with him. Stan was 18 years old, and his father handed him a suitcase and sent him into the world alone. Ford watched it happen. Ford, who believed his brother had deliberately destroyed his future, stood there and let their father send Stan away. That moment is the wound at the center of the entire Pines family story. Everything that comes after, all the years of silence, all the secrets, all the sacrifice and the distance, and the eventual desperate reunion, everything traces back to that night in Glass Shard Beach. Stan left. Ford went to West Coast Tech. And for the better part of a decade, they did not speak. Ford at West Coast Tech completed a doctoral program 3 years ahead of schedule. He met Fiddleford McGucket there, who was working on early personal computer designs, and who became his closest friend. Ford's academic work was extraordinary. His thesis was nationally ranked. He graduated with his doctorate and received a $100,000 research grant, which was a life-changing sum of money in that era. And with that money, yet he chose to do something that felt to him like the logical extension of his entire life story. He chose to study the most unusual place he could find. He chose to dedicate himself to investigating the inexplicable. The most anomalous location in the continental United States, according to his research, was a small town in Oregon called Gravity Falls. Ford arrived in Gravity Falls in the mid to late 1970s and began his research immediately. He had a $100,000 grant and no ties and nothing but time and curiosity and a mind that was genuinely exceptional by any measure. He set up a research lab in the forest outside the town. He started his journals. He documented everything he found. And there was a great deal to find. Gravity Falls was, and is, and a place where the laws of physics are more like suggestions. An area of extreme supernatural density, what Ford's journals call a geographic oddity, where the natural weirdness concentration was higher than anywhere else on the planet. Gnomes, sea creatures in the local lake, cryptids in the forest, interdimensional anomalies. Paranormal events clustered so tightly that Ford could document something new every few weeks for 6 years without running out of material. He wrote, he drew, he cataloged, he investigated. He built a second lab, a bunker hidden deeper in the woods for his most dangerous experiments. He invented things. The electron carpet, a device that could swap the minds of two people who walked across it simultaneously. A mind control tie, which he actually designed for use in presidential campaigns. And he created the shapeshifter's containment cell and locked the creature inside it. He cataloged the Society of the Blind Eye's activities with growing suspicion, starting to understand what was happening to McGucket but not yet knowing the full truth of it. And in 1981, 6 years into his research, he hit a wall. There was a fundamental question he couldn't answer. What was the source of all the weirdness? What was making gravity falls like this? Why here? What was it about this specific piece of Oregon forest that concentrated supernatural energy so densely that the world's laws of nature bent around it? He had documented hundreds of individual anomalies, but he didn't understand the underlying cause. And Ford was not a man who could be satisfied with effects. He needed to understand the cause. He needed the theory of everything. That he needed the answer to the question underneath all the other questions. He found a cave. Deep in the forest, off any path, in a place that had clearly not been visited by anyone in a very long time, Ford found a cave covered in ancient drawings, geometric shapes, warning symbols and styles that suggested indigenous origin, possibly pre-Columbian in age, almost certainly created by people who had lived near this location and understood something about what it was. Among the drawings were specific, clearly intentional symbols for something that had the rough shape of a triangle. With an eye, and surrounding all of it, carved into the stone in a script that Ford spent days translating, was an incantation, a summoning formula, instructions for how to call something into being in the mindscape, how to open a channel of communication with an entity that the original carvers had apparently encountered, and then spent considerable effort warning against ever encountering again. The warnings were clear. The carving said, in essence, do not speak these words aloud. Do not invite this entity in. What it offers is not what it appears to be. There is no deal worth making with this thing. Ford decoded the warnings. He read them. He understood them. And then, because he was a scientist who needed to understand things, and because the warnings made him more curious rather than less, and because he had been alone in his research lab for 6 years with no one to talk to and no one who could remotely understand what he was working on, and because the entity the carvings described apparently possessed knowledge that was described as essentially unlimited, Ford read the incantation aloud. Bill Cipher appeared in Ford's mindscape that night. Imagine what that first meeting must have been like. Ford is alone in his laboratory, has been alone for years, is brilliant beyond almost any measure and lonely in the specific way that brilliant people tend to be lonely, because genius is isolating in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. And into his mind walks something that immediately demonstrates that it knows more than Ford does, that it can see things Ford can't see, that it is perfectly happy to share information, freely and generously, in exchange for nothing more than the ability to move freely within Ford's mind whenever it chooses. Bill introduced himself as a muse, a being that inspired one genius every century, he said, looking for a worthy mind to collaborate with. And Ford, who had spent 6 years looking at the weirdness of gravity falls from every angle and still couldn't find the underlying answer, was exactly the kind of person who would be devastated by the idea that there was a muse available who had been waiting specifically for someone like him. The flattery was calculated. The specific framing, one genius per century, this is what Ford was chosen for. This is why he was born with 6 fingers, was perfectly designed for a man whose entire identity was built around the idea that his differentness was the thing that made him special. They became partners. Bill provided knowledge and insight. Ford provided a mind to occupy and eventually a portal to build. Ford, under Bill's guidance and with access to information about the structure of dimensional physics that no human scientist had ever had access to before, designed a machine, an interdimensional portal, a gateway that could open a passage between the physical world and other dimensions. A machine that Ford genuinely believed for some time would be the greatest scientific achievement in human history. That would benefit humanity in ways no one could fully predict. That would be his legacy. He called McGucket in from California to help him build it. For roughly 2 years, Ford and McGucket worked on the portal together. And during those 2 years, the warning signs about Bill were everywhere. McGucket could see them. McGucket noticed that Ford was receiving information from a source he wouldn't identify. That Ford was designing a building around his workspace that had Bill Cipher's triangle and eye pattern worked into the architectural details. That Ford had begun collecting triangular memorabilia. That his private study had been converted into what was, effectively, a shrine. McGucket confronted Ford about these things. Ford wouldn't explain. He deflected, he minimized, he changed the subject. He was, as Bill's influence on him deepened, becoming less and less the person he had been. And then came the first test of the portal machine. The first test went wrong. McGucket, who was standing near the portal's aperture during the test run with a mechanical dummy, used to evaluate the machine's pull force, was caught in the machine's intake. He was dragged partially through the portal before Ford could pull him back. He survived. He came back to the physical world with his body intact. But something had come through with him, or something had happened to his mind during those brief seconds in the interdimensional space, and whatever it was broke something in Fiddleford McGucket that never entirely healed. McGucket came back from that partial portal transit and immediately resigned. He told Ford that the portal was dangerous, that it needed to be destroyed, that whatever was waiting on the other side of it was not what Ford thought it was. Ford refused. The portal was his life's work. The portal was what Bill had been guiding him toward for 2 years. Ford could not give it up. McGucket left, and Ford stood there in his laboratory with a partially functional interdimensional portal and a growing suspicion, only now beginning to form, that his muse might have had a different agenda from the one he had presented. Ford started investigating. He started looking at the evidence with the skepticism of a scientist rather than the devotion of a collaborator. And what he found, when he actually looked, was terrifying. The portal wasn't designed to open a passage to other dimensions for scientific exploration. It was designed as a specific kind of doorway. A doorway that would allow a being from outside the physical world, a being like Bill, to enter the physical world with a full physical form. The portal was not a scientific instrument. It was a door that Bill had talked Ford into building so that Bill could walk through it. Ford deactivated the portal. He hid the journals, splitting them across 3 separate locations so that no one could have all 3 at once, because anyone with all 3 journals had the knowledge to reactivate the machine. He installed a metal plate inside his own skull to prevent Bill from accessing his mindscape directly. He developed a project he called Project Mentum, a device designed to bioelectrically encrypt his own thoughts so that even if Bill somehow managed to reach him, there would be nothing to find. He wrote in invisible ink. He burned some of what he had written. He became increasingly paranoid, increasingly afraid, increasingly certain that he was being watched, and that the walls of his own mind were not safe. And he reached out to Stan. He hadn't spoken to Stan in nearly a decade. They had not been in contact since the night in Glass Shard Beach when Stan was sent away. And Ford wrote to his brother, the only person he still trusted, the person he had wronged by believing the worst of him all those years ago, and he asked for help. He needed someone to take one of the journals and hide it somewhere Bill couldn't find it. He needed a person outside of Gravity Falls. He needed Stan. Stan came. Of course Stan came. For all the years of silence and all the hurt and all the distance between them, Stan got a distressed letter from his brother, and he got in his car and he drove to Gravity Falls without hesitating. What happened when they were reunited was not a reconciliation. It was an argument. A bad one. Ford was not grateful for Stan's arrival, so much as relieved that there was finally someone present who could take the journal away. Stan, who had spent years trying to make something of himself with nothing, who had been ejected from his own family at 18 years old and had been alone and struggling ever since, was furious. He hadn't been called to reconcile. He had been called to run an errand. He was being used again, and he said so, and Ford said things in return that were not kind. And the argument escalated through Ford's laboratory and back toward the portal, and there was a struggle near the machine, and the portal reactivated, and Ford fell through it. Just like that, in a matter of seconds. Ford was there, and then Ford was gone, swallowed by the machine he had built and deactivated and hidden from the world. Ma pulled into the dimensional space on the other side by the force of the reactivation event. The portal sealed itself. The laboratory was quiet. Stan was alone. Journal 1 was in his hands. Journals 2 and 3 were somewhere out there in the town, hidden by Ford. And the instructions for how to bring Ford back, if there even were any such instructions, were presumably in the journals. Stan looked at what remained of his brother's life's work in that basement, and then he made a decision. He was going to get Ford back. However long it took, whatever it cost, he was going to bring his brother home. Section 6, Stanley Pines, 30 Years of Silence, Babi Ambasai. There is an argument to be made that Stanley Pines is the greatest character in Gravity Falls, and it is a good argument. And it is made more powerful by the way the show hides that argument from you for the first half of its run. In the first season of Gravity Falls, Stan is comic relief. Stan is the lovable con man, the grumpy old uncle who overcharges tourists and falls asleep during family moments, and occasionally says something that makes you question whether he should be legally responsible for anyone. He's funny. He's warm in the specific way that taciturn people can be warm, through action rather than declaration, through showing up rather than saying the right thing. He doesn't say I love you. He says, here's $1, don't tell your sister. He says I never liked that kid anyway when someone hurts Dipper's feelings. He says things that are slightly wrong in a way that is exactly right. You like Stan, you enjoy watching Stan, but you don't. In the first season, think of Stan as the emotional center of the show. You think of him as the setting, the background, the warm context in which the twins' adventures take place. And then comes the end of Season 1 and the second half of Season 2 and the revelation episode, Not What He Seems, and everything you thought about Stan is inverted without warning. Stan had a plan from the moment he watched Ford disappear through the portal. He needed all 3 journals to reactivate the machine. He had one. He needed to find the other 2, but he couldn't look too conspicuous about it. Couldn't let anyone know there was a secret laboratory beneath the house. Couldn't let anyone know he wasn't actually Stanford Pines. So he made the simplest decision available to him. He became Stanford Pines. He had no money. He had no identity documents. He was a wanted man in several states for various low-level cons and scams, and one particularly unfortunate incident involving a hot plate that didn't actually work the way the infomercial suggested. He had nothing. But the people in Gravity Falls had never met the real Stanford Pines. They knew the name. They knew of the eccentric research genius who had been living in the forest. But they hadn't spent significant time with him, and Stan, who was his twin brother, and shared his bone structure and general build and most of his features, walked into town one day, and the store owners looked at him and assumed he was the man they'd heard about. He let them assume. He faked a car crash under the name Stanley Pines, killing his original identity on paper, and he became Stanford Pines. And then he turned the research laboratory into a tourist trap to generate income and to cover the existence of the portal beneath the floorboards. He called it the Mystery Shack, or first the Murder Hut, which Disney apparently asked him to reconsider, and then the Mystery Shack. He built fake exhibits. He bought taxidermied animals and arranged them in nonsensical displays, and charged tourists to see them. He developed a persona. The lovable con man in the fez who talks too fast and overcharges for everything, and definitely doesn't have a secret portal in his basement that he's been trying to reactivate for 30 years. Every night, for 30 years. Stan worked on the portal. He collected Journal 1's instructions and spent years tracking down Journals 2 and 3. Going through Gideon Gleeful's hands, and through Dipper's discovery in the first episode of the show, before finally, in the Season 1 finale, having all 3. Every night for 3 decades, after the tourists went home and the lights went out and the shack was quiet, Stan was down in that basement, working on the machine, running tests, trying to understand what Ford had built well enough to make it work again. 30 years. Over 10,000 nights of work, alone, in secret, without telling anyone, without anyone to help him, working toward a goal that most people would have given up on after a year. A year. Most people don't sustain that kind of focus and determination for a year. Stan sustained it for 30. The weight of that dedication is something the show doesn't shout about. It doesn't play triumphant music over Stan's nightly ritual. It doesn't dramatize the loneliness of it. It just lets you understand it, quietly, once you know the full story. All those years that you watched Stan being grumpy and funny and occasionally irresponsible and always slightly mysterious, he was carrying this. The loss of his brother. The guilt of what happened that night in the laboratory. The stubborn, absolute refusal to let that guilt be the end of the story. The belief that if he just kept working, if he just kept going, someday the portal would open and Ford would come through and everything could be made right. He didn't know what Ford had been doing for 30 years. He didn't know that Ford had been traveling through other dimensions, surviving in places that human beings had no framework to understand. Encountering entities and phenomena that no scientist on Earth had any knowledge of. He didn't know if Ford was alive or dead or somewhere in between. He just kept working. Because that's what you do for your brother. You keep working. You don't stop. And then, in the summer that the show begins, Dipper and Mabel arrive. Stan's great-niece and great-nephew, sent to spend the summer at the Mystery Shack while their parents, who are not given much detail in the show, needed a break. These were kids that Stan clearly hadn't spent much time with before. He was a stranger to them, and they were strangers to him. But something happened over that summer that Stan probably didn't plan for. He started caring about them, genuinely caring. Not in an abstract family obligation way, but in the specific. A personal way that happens when you spend time with someone and you see who they actually are. Dipper with his desperate, anxious curiosity, so much like Ford had been. Mabel with her absolute joy in everything, her inability to be diminished. Stan started to love them, and the show handles that development so gently that you almost don't notice it happening until you look back and realize that the moment where it became permanent was probably somewhere in the 3rd or 4th episode. Having the twins in the shack complicated everything. They were constantly investigating exactly the kind of thing that Stan needed to stay hidden. Dipper found Journal 3, which was the most inconvenient possible development from Stan's perspective, right? Because the journal was both the thing he needed to get the portal working and a guide to all the supernatural phenomena of Gravity Falls that Dipper was now going to be using as a reference document for his own adventures. Every mystery Dipper and Mabel investigated brought them incrementally closer to the truth of what was underneath the shack. Stan managed them. He deflected. He lied when he had to and told half-truths when he could. He did what con men do, which is to say he made sure people were looking at the wrong thing at the right moment. And all the while, the government was watching him. Agents Powers and Trigger, federal agents assigned to investigate anomalous energy readings in the Gravity Falls area, had been building a case against Stan for a long time before the events of the show began. They suspected him of harboring illegal scientific equipment. They suspected him of being involved in the energy readings that the portal was generating. They didn't know about the portal specifically, not yet, but they were getting closer. And in the 2nd season, they were close enough that Stan's deception was coming apart at the seams. When the portal finally activated, in the episode Not What He Seems, Stan had already been arrested. He'd been caught stealing radioactive material to use as a power source for the machine and was in federal custody. Dipper and Mabel, who had broken into the shack looking for answers, found the hidden room with the fake IDs and the newspaper clipping about the death of Stan Pines, and the evidence that their Grunkle Stan was living under a stolen identity. Their trust was gone. Or nearly gone. The portal was approaching full activation, and the government agents were there, and the world was on the edge of something catastrophic. Because Ford's journals had warned, explicitly, that reactivating the portal at full capacity risked ending the world. The energy readings were off the charts. The machine was doing things no one fully understood. And Mabel, in that moment, had to decide whether to trust Stan. The control panel had a single button that could shut the whole thing down. All she had to do was press it. Everything would stop. The portal would deactivate. The danger would pass. And her Grunkle Stan, the man who had been lying to her and her brother all summer, would have lost the one chance he had worked 30 years for. Mabel stood at that console with her hand over the button, and she looked at Stan, who couldn't speak, who could only look back at her, and she made her decision. She stepped away from the console. She let it run. And through the portal stepped Stanford Pines, six-fingered and exhausted, and 30 years older and incredibly, furiously unhappy, to discover that his brother had been running a tourist trap called the Mystery Shack out of his research laboratory for 3 decades. He punched Stan the moment he saw him. Stan had a portal open, and a pair of federal agents upstairs, and a niece and nephew who had just spent 3 months learning to love a man who'd been lying to them the whole time. And the first thing Ford did when he stepped through was punch him square in the face, which is, if you know these two, kind of perfect. The reunion that followed, the full backstory told to Dipper and Mabel in the episode A Tale of Two Stans. This is one of the most emotionally dense things the show ever does. It is the moment where the whole architecture of the secret is revealed, and it hits hard because by the time you get there, you have already spent an entire season and then some getting to know these people. You understand what those 30 years cost. You understand the weight of what Stan sacrificed and the weight of what Ford lost, and the specific, tragic way that a single terrible night and a single moment of carelessness set in motion a chain of events that separated two brothers for the better part of a lifetime. And what makes Stan's character arc over the entire run of the show so powerful is the consistency of it. Stan is not secretly a genius. He is not secretly clever in the way Ford is clever. He is street smart, and he is stubborn, and he is deeply and fiercely loyal, and he loves his family in a way that he expresses almost exclusively through what he does, rather than what he says. The 30-year Portal project is not the act of a brilliant man. It is the act of a determined one. Of a man who decided that the only thing that mattered was bringing his brother home, and who worked on that decision every single night for 30 years with no guarantee that it was going to work, with no one to tell him it was working, with no encouragement and no validation and no evidence that he hadn't just been wasting his life in a basement in Oregon while Ford was gone forever, somewhere he could never reach. And then in the finale, when everything comes down to the last possible moment, and Bill is inside the mind of one of the Pines brothers, and the only way to kill him is to erase everything that is in that mind, Stan volunteers. He doesn't hesitate. Ford is the one who knows how to shut down the nightmare realm. Ford is the one who has information Bill is actively trying to extract. If Bill is in Ford's mind when the memory gun fires, Ford loses himself to save the world. That's the plan that had been laid out. But Stan switches clothes with Ford, tricks Bill into entering the wrong mind, and then sits back in the living room of the mystery shack he has called home for 30 years, and waits for Ford to pull the trigger. He tells Bill, when Bill realizes too late that he's in the wrong mind, that Bill made the fatal mistake of messing with his family. And then Stan's mind burns with Bill inside it. And Bill screams and comes apart, and the sun starts to rise over Gravity Falls. And it is over. Stan wakes up with nothing. No memories, no knowledge of the twins, of Ford, of 30 years of his own life. He doesn't know where he is or who these people are or why they look at him the way they look at him. With that specific mixture of grief and love that is the face of people looking at someone they have nearly lost. He doesn't know that he has just saved the world. He doesn't know that Ford is calling him a hero. He doesn't know any of it. And Mabel gets out her scrapbook, the one she's been making all summer. And she sits with him and shows him the pictures, one by one. And nothing registers, nothing comes back, until she gets to a page with Waddles on it, her pet pig, the pig that Stan has been quietly, gruffly fond of all summer, despite pretending otherwise, and Stan looks at the pig and calls him by name. Just like that, a reflex, a habit so deep that even a wiped mind couldn't entirely erase it. Waddles, a single word, and everything starts to come back. Memory by memory, the way it sometimes does. The way important things have a way of finding their way back. Stan is, in the end, the heart of the show. Not the most interesting character, not the deepest or the most complicated. The heart. The stubborn, loyal, imperfect, quietly loving heart of a story about family and sacrifice and what it means to refuse to give up on the people you love. There is something that the show does with the Pines family that deserves extended attention before we move on to McGucket and the Society and the full sweep of the show's second season. It does something that very few family stories in any medium manage to do, which is to present the love in a family and the damage in a family as genuinely simultaneous rather than sequential. It doesn't show you a loving family and then reveal the damage as a twist. It doesn't show you a damaged family and then redeem it through the discovery of love. It shows you both things at the same time, present and real and intertwined, which is what actual families are like. Philbrick Pines, Stan and Ford's father, is not a villain. He is also not a good parent. The show is precise about this in the handful of scenes we see him in. How he pushed both his sons hard because he genuinely believed that was how you made something of people. He valued Ford's intelligence because he could see the practical payoff, the scholarship money, the family financial security that Ford's brilliance might eventually produce. He dismissed Stan because Stan didn't show him a path to any of that. His disowning of Stan was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the logical outcome of a value system that was entirely transactional and that had no room for the kind of mess Stan represented. And Stan, who inherited some of his father's transactional energy, even as he rejected his father's specific values, became someone who showed love through action because his father had taught him that words were just noise. Stan says I love you by building a portal for 30 years, but by turning a research facility into a tourist trap so that he could keep paying the mortgage and keep working toward the goal. By lying to everyone around him to protect a secret that he carried completely alone for 3 decades. By sacrificing his mind when the moment demanded it. Stan's love is entirely in his hands, entirely in what he does. Entirely in the relentless stubbornness of someone who decided once that his family was worth everything and never found a reason to revise that decision. Ford's love is more complicated because Ford spent decades convinced that love was a category he wasn't particularly suited to. His relationships historically went wrong, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much about the wrong things. He cared about the work more than about the people. Had he cared about the knowledge more than about the relationships. He cared about being special more than about being close. His relationship with Dipper in the second season replicates the error of his relationship with Bill in an interesting way. He singles out Dipper as exceptional. He offers Dipper validation and recognition and the promise of becoming something great. He pulls Dipper toward isolation, toward the specialized knowledge of the paranormal researcher, away from the ordinary connections that constitute a 12-year-old's life. He does not intend any of this as manipulation, but the shape of it is familiar, and the show lets you see the shape of it without being heavy-handed about it. Dipper's resistance to Ford's offer, his choice of Mabel over the apprenticeship, is the moment where the pattern breaks. Where Dipper understands, on some level he might not be able to fully articulate, that extraordinary loneliness is not the same thing as extraordinary purpose. Mabel's relationship with Stan is also worth holding. There is a moment in Not What He Seems when Mabel has to decide whether to trust Stan, and she does. And the basis of her trust is not anything he has said to her. She is making the decision based on who she has seen him be. Based on 30 hours, roughly, of actual experience with this specific person, which is all they have had together since she arrived that summer. And what she saw in those 30 hours was someone who showed up, who was there, who took her seriously in his gruff, deflecting, occasionally accidentally touching way. That is enough for Mabel. For Mabel, that is everything, and she is right. Much not every kind of trust needs extensive evidence. Some of it is earned in small moments that accumulate like interest, and Mabel had been collecting small moments all summer. The Pines family, in the final accounting of the show, is a family that nearly came apart and didn't. That nearly lost itself to secrets and misunderstanding, and the vast specific geography of 30 years of silence and didn't. That had every reason to be broken and chose, collectively and individually, and sometimes without knowing they were choosing, to be something else. That is not an easy story. It is an honest one. And honesty, in the hands of a writer who knows what they're doing, is more moving than any amount of orchestration. And now, before we get to McGucket and the society and the twins and the town and the apocalypse and everything else that remains, let me ask you something. If you're still with me, settle a little deeper into wherever you are. Let your shoulders come down. Let your breathing slow. This story has been going for a while, and we're not even halfway through, but that's exactly the point tonight. We're not in a hurry. The pines are all around us. The fog is in the valley, and Bill is somewhere in the dark. But the Pines family is here too. And that, more than anything else, is what this show was always about. Expedia. Section 7. Fiddleford McGucket and the Society of the Blind Eye. Yes. There is a moment in the episode Society of the Blind Eye, Season 2, Episode 7, where Old Man McGucket stands in the Hall of the Forgotten underneath the Gravity Falls Museum of History, and his memories begin to come back. They flow out of stored glass capsules and back into his mind, years of experience that he had deliberately erased from himself. And you watch the expression on his face move through a series of emotions that you don't usually expect from a comedy character in a Disney cartoon. Relief, horror, grief. The specific, complicated grief of someone who has recovered a version of themselves they had thought was gone forever, only to find that the version of themselves they are now is the legacy of all the things they couldn't bear to know. Before we can understand the Society of the Blind Eye and what it meant for Gravity Falls, we have to understand Fiddleford Hadron McGucket. Now, the man before the madness, because that man was extraordinary. Fiddleford attended Backups University in the mid-1970s, where Ford describes him in Journal 3 as a young but brilliant mechanic. This is actually a significant understatement. McGucket, during his time at Backups was doing work on early personal computing that was years ahead of what most people in the field were thinking about. He was building personalized computers in the days before personal computers were a category that mainstream society had conceived of. He had a gift for mechanical systems, for understanding how physical components could be arranged to produce specific functional outcomes that was different in kind from Ford's theoretical intelligence, but no less impressive. Ford was a genius of ideas. Also, McGucket was a genius of making things work. They met at Backups and they complemented each other perfectly. Ford needed someone who could translate his theoretical designs into functioning machines. McGucket needed someone who could give his mechanical talent something worthy of its range. They became friends, close enough that when Ford finally finished his doctoral program and received his grant and set off for Gravity Falls, he called McGucket years later when the Portal project became too large for one person. And McGucket came. He left his work in Palo Alto, he left the family he was building, and he came to Oregon because Ford asked him to. The Pines family story is full of people who drop everything for the people they love. Stan crossed the country for Ford when Ford needed him, even after a decade of silence. McGucket came to Oregon because Ford asked. These are the same kind of loyalty, the same bone-deep willingness to show up. And in both cases, the people who showed up were damaged by what they found when they got there. McGucket worked with Ford on the Portal for roughly 2 years. And in those 2 years, something was happening to Ford that McGucket could see clearly and couldn't get Ford to acknowledge. Ford was changing. The personality changes were subtle at first and then less so. The triangular decorations appearing around the research facility. The private study being converted into something that felt uncomfortably like devotion. The source of information that Ford was clearly drawing from but wouldn't name. McGucket suspected. McGucket confronted Ford more than once, in various ways, trying to get him to acknowledge what was happening. Ford deflected every time. The work continued, and then came the first test run of the Portal. There are different accounts of exactly how the first test went wrong. The broad shape of it is consistent. McGucket was too close to the aperture when the machine activated. A mechanical dummy was being used to test the portal's pull force, and something about the dynamics of the test drew McGucket into the intake field along with the dummy. He was partially dragged through the portal before Ford managed to kill the power and pull him back. He survived. He came back in one piece. But what he saw in those few seconds in the dimensional space of the portal broke something in him permanently. But the show never fully specifies what was on the other side of the portal aperture during that test. The implication is that it was something from the nightmare realm, or something adjacent to it, something that didn't belong in the physical world and that McGucket's mind was not equipped to process. He had seen the face of whatever it was that Bill had been pointing Ford toward, and it was not something that a human mind could hold without damage. McGucket came back from the portal experience and immediately demanded that Ford destroy the machine. When Ford refused, McGucket quit. He left the project. He walked away from Gravity Falls, walked away from Ford, walked away from the thing they had built together. And he stayed in Gravity Falls because he couldn't quite make himself leave, and because he was already beginning to understand that he was not going to be able to sleep again in any ordinary way with what he had seen inside his head. The nightmares were constant. The intrusive thoughts were relentless. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that aperture, and whatever he had seen was right there waiting for him. He couldn't eat properly. He couldn't sleep properly. He couldn't think about anything else. The paranormal horror of what he'd glimpsed had lodged in his brain like a splinter that couldn't be removed, and he was deteriorating quickly, visibly, in a way that the people of Gravity Falls who knew him in those early days must have found alarming. So he built something. Fiddleford McGucket, mechanical genius and former research partner to one of the most brilliant scientists in the country, built a device that could remove specific memories from a person's mind. He called it the memory erasing gun. It worked by targeting specific recall pathways in the brain, encapsulating the memory in a glass tube that could be detached from the gun and stored elsewhere, removing it from the host mind without destroying it. The removed memory could, in principle, be returned later by re-exposing the host to the memory tube. Or it could be stored permanently in a hall somewhere, keeping the memory safe and accessible while keeping its owner free of it. McGucket used it on himself first. He removed his memory of what he had seen through the portal aperture. And for the first time since that test, he slept without nightmares. He felt, he said later, that the specific relief of someone who has been carrying a weight too heavy for their body and has finally been allowed to set it down. The relief was so profound and so complete that it became, in the way that certain kinds of relief can, a solution he returned to again and again. Not just for the portal memory, for every strange and frightening thing he encountered in Gravity Falls afterward, for every reminder of the work he had done and the portal he had helped build and the place he had seen. Each time the anxiety came back, he used the gun. Each time the nightmares returned, he used the gun. Again and again and again, over months and then years. The side effects were cumulative. The memory-erasing gun, as McGucket himself eventually documented in his research, caused progressive neural damage with repeated use. Minor at first. A slight fuzziness at the edges of experience. Occasional word retrieval difficulties. Small gaps where something should have been and wasn't quite accessible. But with each additional use, the damage compounded. Memories began to overlap. The boundaries between stored memories and present experience became permeable. He forgot things he hadn't intended to forget. He lost coherence in pieces, not all at once, the way a piece of paper loses its structural integrity, one tear at a time until it can no longer hold its own shape. And still he used the gun, because the alternative was remembering, and remembering was worse. Somewhere in this process, Fiddleford McGucket had an idea. He was not the only person in Gravity Falls who had seen things they couldn't process. The town was full of them. Unordinary people who had encountered gnomes or sea monsters, or the Society's activities, or any of the dozens of other paranormal phenomena that Ford had documented, and who had been left with the kind of memory that doesn't leave you alone. McGucket's solution, the solution that had worked so well for him, at least in the short term, could work for them too. He could give them peace. He could take away the things that frightened them and keep those things somewhere safe. Somewhere they could be retrieved if anyone ever decided they wanted them back. He founded the Society of the Blind Eye in just 17 days. He chose the name carefully. A blind eye, the thing you turn to the truth when you've decided you don't want to see it. The symbol he chose was an eye with an X through it. A crossed-out eye, an eye that can no longer see. He recruited the first members from among the people he had already helped. People who had come to him desperate and frightened and left without their nightmares. They were grateful. They believed in the organization's purpose. And for a while, the society was exactly what it claimed to be. A support organization for people who had been traumatized by the genuine horrors of living in a paranormally saturated small town, offering a kind and voluntary solution to those horrors. But McGucket's own condition was deteriorating steadily through this period. By the time the society was established and running, he had erased enough of his own memories that large sections of his personal history were simply gone. He didn't remember his time at Backups More very clearly. He didn't remember much of his work with Ford. He didn't remember the early months in Gravity Falls before he had started erasing things. He had holes where years of his life should have been, and in those holes something strange had grown. A kind of second self, disconnected from the person he had been, occupying the empty space left by everything he had deleted. He started behaving in the erratic, eccentric ways that the townspeople of Gravity Falls remember him for. The animal companions, the bizarre inventions, the speaking in tongues and the unexpected bursts of apparently random activity, and the enormous eyes that were partly a physical consequence of whatever was happening to his brain, and partly just what was left when so much else had been taken away. Old Man McGucket. By the time Dipper and Mabel arrive in Gravity Falls in 2012, Hi appears to be a harmless, elderly eccentric living in the town junkyard, beloved as a local character, gently mocked by people who don't know what he used to be. He can't remember anything from before 1982. 30 years of his life are simply inaccessible to him. His son Tate is estranged. His wife, who he had before all of this began, is long gone. He built mechanical things, increasingly strange and increasingly powerful things, from the junk around him, because the mechanical genius was still in there, still operating, even as everything else came apart. The Gobblewonker in Season 1's second episode was a mechanical sea monster that McGucket built because his son never wanted to spend time with him and he needed someone to notice. The Shamebot was something he built when a friend didn't show up to his retirement party. Now, these are the things he was still doing. These enormous and elaborate mechanical expressions of the emotional states that his dissolved memory had left him unable to fully process any other way. After his rescue in Society of the Blind Eye, McGucket begins the slow process of recovery. He gets his memories back. He faces what he had done and what had been done to him. And his story doesn't end in tragedy, which is one of the genuinely hopeful things about Gravity Falls. By the time of Weirdmageddon, McGucket has recovered enough to be a functioning ally to the Resistance. He fixes the laptop that unlocks the next stage of the mystery. He moves into Northwest Manor, which is an interesting reversal of social status. The mad hermit in the junkyard becomes the resident of the biggest house in town. He reconnects with his son. He starts to build something that looks like a life again. But the Society of the Blind Eye, even after McGucket's recovery, is a thing that needs to be understood in its full context. Because it wasn't just a support organization. It was, over the years and especially under the leadership of its later leader, Blind Ivan, an organization that had decided to make a political choice on behalf of the entire town. The choice to remain ignorant, the choice to never know. The Society's later iterations weren't helping traumatized individuals voluntarily process their fears. They were imposing selective amnesia on unwilling townspeople, erasing memories without consent, deciding that the people of Gravity Falls were better off not knowing what was living in their woods and under their museum and behind their diners. Blind Ivan, the Society's eventual leader, had gone further than McGucket ever intended. He was erasing inconvenient truths, protecting secrets, using the gun as an instrument of social control rather than personal mercy. And the people who were being erased didn't always know it had happened. Lazy Susan, who appears in the episode that reveals the Society, had witnessed a gnome theft and was being actively processed by the Society when the kids arrived to stop it. She doesn't remember anything after the procedure. She loses context for experiences that have now been removed from her mind, leaving small fractures in her continuity of self that she will have to live with without ever understanding where they came from. Yet, the Society of the Blind Eye is a brilliant piece of world building, because it is genuinely morally ambiguous in a way that the show never oversimplifies. The question it poses, whether it is better to know and be damaged or to not know and be whole, is not a question the show pretends to fully answer. McGucket's story suggests that forgetting has costs you can't anticipate, that the damage of erasing your own history is cumulative and eventually catastrophic, that the things you can't remember don't stop mattering just because they're gone. But the show also understands why the temptation is so powerful. Understanding why people choose the blind eye while insisting on the importance of opening it is a more honest position than simple judgment would be. And this is the show all over. It never gives you the easy version of the moral, but it gives you the true version, which is harder and more demanding and ultimately more nourishing. Igixaya. Section 8. Dipper and Mabel, the heart of everything in the 6. We have spent a lot of time so far with the adults, with Ford and Stan and McGucket and Bill, with the people whose secrets and choices and failures created the world that Dipper and Mabel walk into at the beginning of the summer. And that is appropriate because Gravity Falls is in many ways a show about what children inherit from the adults around them, about how the mistakes and the hidden things and the unresolved wounds of the previous generation shape the world that the next generation has to navigate. But the twins are not just navigators. They're not just the child protagonists through whom we experience the adults' stories. They have their own stories. And their own stories are not small. Mason Pines, who goes by Dipper because of the big dipper-shaped birthmark on his forehead that he hides under his cap, is 12 years old at the start of Gravity Falls. He is, as Alex Hirsch has said in interviews, smart but not a walking calculator. He is academically capable, good at observation and pattern recognition and cryptography and logical reasoning. But he is also a 12-year-old with a 12-year-old's insecurities and blind spots and enthusiasms and mistakes. He wants very badly to be taken seriously. He wants adults to treat him as an intellectual equal. He wants to be the kind of person who solves mysteries and doesn't need help and figures things out independently, and then gets to demonstrate that he figured them out. He is, in short, a child who wants to be older than he is, and who sometimes sacrifices the genuine goods of being 12 in his rush toward the goods of being a grown-up. His relationship with Ford, once Ford appears in the second season, is one of the most interesting dynamics in the show. Dipper has idolized the author of the journals for the entire run of the show. The journals have been his guide and his foundation, the thing that made it possible for him to navigate the supernatural weirdness of Gravity Falls and survive it and actually help people. Finding out that the author was his own great-uncle, that he was related by blood to this person he had revered as a kind of distant genius, was an enormous moment for Dipper. And Ford, who was lonely after 30 years in other dimensions, and who saw in Dipper a reflection of his own younger self, genuinely wanted to mentor him. He offered Dipper a kind of validation and recognition that Dipper had been starving for. The problem was what Ford was willing to offer Dipper in the context of that mentorship. Ford floated, more than once in the second season, the idea that Dipper should stay in Gravity Falls after the summer ended, should continue the research, should become Ford's apprentice and dedicate himself to the scientific investigation of the paranormal. And Dipper was tempted. He was desperately, painfully tempted, because it was exactly the kind of offer that the part of him who wanted to be taken seriously and recognized as exceptional and treated as an equal had always been waiting for. But staying would have meant leaving Mabel, and Dipper could not leave Mabel. This tension, between what Dipper wanted for himself and what his loyalty to his twin demanded, is the central conflict of the second season's character arc for Dipper. It plays out across multiple episodes and reaches its most painful expression in the episode Dipper and Mabel versus the Future, where the twins have their most significant fight of the series. Mabel is terrified of the future. She doesn't want summer to end. She doesn't want to turn 13 and become a teenager and leave childhood behind. She knows in a way she can barely articulate that the summer in Gravity Falls has been the best thing that has ever happened to her, and that whatever comes after can't possibly be as good. And she's afraid that she and Dipper are going to grow up and grow apart, and she's going to lose the person she loves most in the world. And Dipper, in that episode, is so focused on his own opportunity and his own future that he fails to hear what Mabel is telling him about hers. He dismisses her fear. He is not present for her in the way she needs him to be. And the argument that results from that absence is the crack in their relationship that Bill exploits. It is Bill who shows Mabel a vision of what the future could look like if she stays, if summer never ends. A perfect, eternal summer, just the way it has been, with Dipper and everyone she loves, forever. And Mabel, in her grief and her fear and her hurt from the fight with Dipper, takes the deal. She lets Bill put her in the bubble. She chooses the eternal summer because the future that is coming looks too painful from where she's standing. The bubble is called Mabeland in the show's terminology. Though that name is used somewhat loosely, it's a prison that looks like a paradise. It contains a perfect version of everything Mabel loves, with one crucial difference from reality. Everything in it is obligated to make her happy. The people in it don't have their own needs. They don't have their own fears or their own bad days. They are there exclusively to love Mabel and agree with Mabel and tell Mabel that everything is fine and always will be. And in the second episode of Weirdmageddon, when Dipper goes in to rescue her, he has to help her understand what she's been given. That the perfect eternal summer is perfect and eternal precisely because it isn't real. That the warmth of real relationships comes from the fact that the other person is genuinely present, genuinely themselves, capable of having a bad day and a conflicting opinion, and a need that doesn't perfectly align with yours. A Dipper who only ever does what Mabel wants isn't really Dipper. A love that can never be withdrawn isn't really love. Mabel choosing to leave the bubble is one of the most quietly mature things the show asks of any of its characters. It requires her to give up something that looks perfect in favor of something that is real. It requires her to accept that growing up means loss as well as gain. It requires her to face the fear she had been carrying all summer and to walk toward it rather than away from it. And she does it. 12-year-old Mabel Pines in her sparkle sweater, her heart full of craft projects and sticker collections, and genuine unguarded love for everyone around her, chooses the real world. She chooses to grow up. Just the twins' relationship is the engine of the show in a way that is easy to take for granted because it operates so naturally. Dipper and Mabel fight. They have different needs and different fears and different ways of moving through the world. They disagree, sometimes significantly, but the underlying fact of their love for each other is never in question, not for a moment. Hirsch has talked about how the show is at its most basic. A love story between two siblings. A story about what it means to have a person who is yours and who you are theirs, and how that relationship changes and deepens as you both change and grow. The supernatural stuff is the setting. The twins are the story. The show's creator has said that Dipper and Mabel's 13th birthday falls on the last day of summer in Gravity Falls. This is never stated explicitly in the show itself, but Hirsch confirmed it. 13 is the border crossing. It's the age at which you are, by the most basic cultural reckoning, no longer a child. The summer was the last summer of childhood, and everything they went through in it, the journals and the portal and the society and Bill and the fight and the reunion and the sacrifice and the restoration, all of it happened in the last summer they would have as children. There's a weight to that, knowing it. There's a reason it feels as significant as it does. In the series finale, as the twins leave Gravity Falls on the bus home, Dipper opens the note that Wendy slipped into his pocket on the way out. And it says, "See you next summer." And it's hopeful. It's genuinely, cleanly hopeful in a way that the show has earned by the time it delivers that moment. They did the thing. They survived the thing. They grew in the way they needed to grow, and they held on to what mattered. And they are going home together as 13-year-olds who know more about themselves and each other and the world than anyone their age should probably know. And next summer is waiting for them. Let's also spend some time with the secondary cast because Gravity Falls populated its background with people who are more than set dressing. Seuss Ramirez, the Mystery Shack's handyman, is a 22-year-old man of enormous warmth and enthusiastic incompetence, a person whose entire defining characteristic is the size of his love for the people around him. He grew up without a father, waiting every year for his dad to come home for his birthday and every year being disappointed. His relationship with Stan became, over years of working at the shack, a surrogate father-son relationship that Stan absolutely would not acknowledge out loud, but that he absolutely acted on in every way that mattered. At the end of the series, Stan names Seuss the manager of the Mystery Shack. It is the closest Stan will ever come to saying the words. And Seuss knows that. And Seuss is more than fine with it. Wendy Corduroy is 15, the daughter of the local lumberjack Manly Dan, and she is one of those teenagers who appears effortlessly competent and fearless and cool, while actually carrying a fair amount of weight that she mostly doesn't show. She's the oldest kid in the show's cast. She's been in Gravity Falls her whole life. She knows things about the town that the twins are just learning. Not in the journal sense, but in the lived sense, the way you know the particular quality of the light in summer afternoons when you've grown up watching it. Her reaction to Weirdmageddon, to the apocalypse that erupts around her while Dipper is out of commission, is essentially to become a one-woman survival expert. She builds a fort in the mall. She sets traps. She keeps herself and others alive using knowledge accumulated from a lifetime growing up in this particular strange place. And the note she leaves Dipper, "See you next summer," is the most Wendy thing she could possibly do. Understated, warm, entirely devoid of drama, and more moving than something 3 times as elaborate. Pacifica Northwest, who appears first as an antagonist and becomes something more complicated as the season progresses, is one of the show's most effective character studies. She is the daughter of the town's richest and most prominent family, and she is aware, on some level, of the weight of what that means. Her parents are not good people. The show demonstrates this concisely and unflinchingly. The moment where her father rings a bell and her body language instantly changes, going small and fearful, is one of the most efficient pieces of character shorthand in the whole show. She has been trained since childhood to behave in specific ways, to hold specific attitudes, to perform the role of the Northwest heir, even when that role requires her to be someone she doesn't want to be. And her arc across the second season is the slow, difficult process of learning that she doesn't have to be what her family made her, that the name Northwest doesn't have to define her. In Northwest Mansion Mystery, when the ghost of a pioneer lumberjack haunts her family's property because of a broken promise made generations ago, and Pacifica is the one who can resolve it by opening the mansion's gates to ordinary people, she does it, against her parents' explicit wishes, in the face of their disapproval. She breaks the cycle. It is a small act, in the context of everything else happening in the season, but the show treats it with full weight. It is the moment Pacifica chooses herself over her family's legacy. And that matters. The town of Gravity Falls itself, as a character, is worth dwelling on. These are not just background extras. The townspeople are people, with their own stories, their own fears, their own relationships to the strangeness of where they live. Toby Determined, the local journalist who is objectively terrible at journalism, but genuinely enthusiastic about it. Blubbs and Durland, the local sheriff and deputy, who are slowly, gently, across the run of the show, revealed to be in love with each other, in the most careful and deliberate progression of a relationship that Disney's censors couldn't cut without excising some very basic background details. Manly Dan, who processes every emotion through physical violence against trees. Bud Gleeful, who is not a good person, but whose story connects to the broader theme of the Society of the Blind Eye and the costs of choosing not to know. All of these people matter. All of them are in Gravity Falls for reasons that make sense for them. And all of them are there for the summer that changes everything. Section 9. The creatures, the town, and the weirdness of Gravity Falls. Let's slow down for a moment and just breathe the air of the place. Let's actually be in Gravity Falls for a while, in the way that you can be in a place when someone describes it well enough, when the language settles around you like weather, and you can feel the altitude in it, the cool density of pine air, and the particular quality of morning light in a forest that's older than anything you've ever stood in. Gravity Falls. Oregon is a small town. A few hundred people, maybe fewer. It sits in a valley ringed by forest so thick and dark that the trees are like a wall between the town and the rest of the world. There is a waterfall. There is a lake. There are mountains in the distance on clear days, though clear days are not the most common weather pattern in this part of the Pacific Northwest. The fog comes in regularly, soft and thick, settling into the lower ground and making the morning feel like something from another world. The pines are enormous. Old growth trees, some of them, the kind that were standing before anyone who is currently alive was born, the kind that have seen things and would tell you about them if trees were the telling type. The weirdness of the town has a specific origin story. A UFO crashed in this valley approximately tens of millions of years ago, or possibly longer, and the energy of its impact and the materials from its construction created a geographic anomaly, a pocket of altered physical laws, and a place where the membrane between the physical world and the spaces between dimensions, the nightmare realm and whatever else is out there in the gaps of the multiverse, is significantly thinner than anywhere else on Earth. This information comes from a combination of the show's mythology and the extended lore in the journals, and their real-world counterparts. The indigenous people who first encountered this location understood it immediately. They recognized the wrongness of it, the way that standing in it felt different from standing anywhere else, the way that things happened here that didn't happen elsewhere. They documented it carefully. They left warnings. They created drawings and symbols and instructional carvings for anyone who came after. And eventually, over generations, they stopped living near it. Most because places that are thin between worlds are not places where ordinary daily life sits comfortably. But Quentin Tremblay III, the eighth and a half President of the United States, which is an office that the show claims existed between the seventh and eighth presidencies, and which history has since covered over, founded the town of Gravity Falls in 1841 when he literally stumbled into the valley riding his horse backwards. The show treats this as historical fact within its fiction, and there is an entire episode, Irrational Treasure, dedicated to Dipper and Mabel uncovering the conspiracy by which Tremblay's presidency was erased from the official record and replaced by the much more traditionally presidential William Henry Harrison. Tremblay was apparently impeached due to what the official documents describe as rampant silliness. He was preserved in peanut brittle for a century and a half and then thawed out by Dipper and Mabel and sent off to live in the untamed wilderness of the modern world. It is that kind of show. The creatures cataloged in Ford's journals are a comprehensive bestiary of everything strange that the thin membrane between dimensions has allowed through or generated in and around Gravity Falls. Let's walk through some of them, slowly, letting each one settle. The Gnomes. Jeff and his colony of hundreds, living underground in a complex social hierarchy. They are small and have the visual appearance of traditional garden gnomes, complete with the red hats, though they are mobile and vocal and capable of cooperative behavior on a scale that suggests genuine organizational intelligence. Their romantic interest in human women is documented in Journal 3 with a mixture of scientific precision and what reads very much like exasperation. They can form themselves into a single large being by stacking and merging, a defensive and offensive capability that makes them significantly more dangerous than their individual size would suggest. Ford spent a great deal of time observing and documenting the gnome colony in the early years of his research, and his notes have both the quality of genuine scientific curiosity and the quality of someone who can't quite believe what he's looking at. The lake creature, the lake in Gravity Falls harbors something. But the show doesn't commit entirely to what it is or how large. There are multiple glimpses across the series, and Ford's journals have an entry that describes a creature of considerable size that occasionally surfaces but is generally content to remain below the waterline. The locals have a relationship with this creature that is less fearful than practical. It's just the thing in the lake. You don't go out in small boats at night, and it doesn't come onto land, and everyone gets along fine. It's exactly the kind of supernatural coexistence that Ford found all over Gravity Falls, where the ordinary and the impossible had been living alongside each other long enough to develop something like an arrangement. The pterodactyls in the bunker below the Mystery Shack's forest, the shapeshifter, the manitors, the minotaur-like beings living in the mountain caves who have developed an elaborate culture around the concept of manliness, with specific tests and rituals and criteria that Dipper encounters in one of the first season's more comedic episodes. The merge, which Ford describes as an event where multiple smaller entities combine into a single larger one, a phenomenon he observed in the gnomes and noted in other species as well. The hide behind, which never appears on screen because the entire concept of it is that you cannot see it. It is always just outside your field of vision. It moves when you move. If you look directly toward it, it has already moved. Ford's journal entry on the hide behind is brief and reads like the notes of a scientist who spent a significant amount of time in the forest trying to turn around fast enough to catch it, and who eventually concluded that this particular challenge was fundamentally unwinnable. The gremloblin, which combines the word gremlin with the word goblin, and is a small, grotesque, fleshy creature whose eyes, when looked into directly, cause the viewer to hallucinate their deepest fears as if they were happening in real time. This is the creature that partially broke McGucket. That was one of the first things he encountered in Gravity Falls that he couldn't process and couldn't unsee, and that contributed to his first use of the memory gun. Ford's entry on it in the journal is extensive and includes advice on how to avoid looking into its eyes, which is the kind of practical survival note that makes Ford's journals feel genuinely useful rather than just academic. The zombie apocalypse, or something approximating one, appears in the show's Season 2 premiere Scary Oak, when the cryptogram in the credits of the Season 1 finale, when decoded, turned out to contain instructions for summoning the dead, and those instructions were used in an episode that functioned as a zombie attack story. Ford's journals contain an entry on zombies, as does Journal 2, with detailed notes on their weaknesses, which include a harmony of 3 or more voices singing in unison. This is the kind of information that would seem almost comically specialized until you are actually being chased through the Mystery Shack by animated corpses, and suddenly having the specific page memorized is the thing that saves your life. The Northwest family's house, a mansion that serves as the setting for one of the best episodes of Season 2, contains its own supernatural element. A pioneer lumberjack named Archibald Corduroy was promised by the Northwest family that if he and his fellow workers built their mansion, they would be welcomed into it annually for a party open to all the people of Gravity Falls. The Northwests never honored that promise, and Archibald, having died before the debt was paid, came back to collect, using supernatural power to turn the wealthy guests at the Northwest party into wood. But Ford had documented this phenomenon in the journals. He knew about the promise. He knew about the threat. He had information that, in the right hands at the right moment, could have prevented the haunting. The journals consistently function this way in the show, as a resource that is almost sufficient but never quite adequate, because the author was operating with incomplete information, and the situations that arise are always slightly more complicated than what any document can fully prepare you for. And then there is the alien infrastructure beneath the town. The crash site that created the valley, which is ancient enough that everything visible on the surface is long gone, but whose underground remnants are still there, still influencing the local physics in ways that account for the concentration of supernatural energy. There's a bunker in the woods that Ford built, partly to store his most dangerous experiments, and partly as shelter against the potential apocalypse he increasingly believed was coming. The bunker features the shapeshifter's containment cell, a creature that was apparently there before Ford, and that Ford chose to secure rather than destroy. In the episode Into the Bunker, where Dipper and Mabel and their friends go to investigate the bunker for the first time, the shapeshifter is still there, having maintained its imprisonment for the years since Ford disappeared. It has had a great deal of time to be alone and to think. It has not become more friendly in the interim. The shapeshifter is one of the most genuinely unsettling things in the show because of what it implies. And a creature that can become anything it has ever seen includes a creature that can become you. It can become the people you love. It can become a perfect replica of your brother or your sister or your best friend. And the only way you would know is if you happen to catch it in transition. It can wear any face indefinitely. It has been doing this for an unknown length of time. It has been in Gravity Falls as long as the research facility has been there, possibly longer, possibly since the UFO crash or since the beginning of whatever geological process made this valley what it is. Every creature you have ever interacted with in Gravity Falls could, theoretically, have been the shapeshifter. Ford's journal doesn't rule this out. He documented the creature as being in the containment cell, but he also documented his own uncertainty about how fully the containment worked. Comfortable with that? Good. Let's keep going. The more time you spend in Gravity Falls, the more you understand what Ford was doing when he documented everything so carefully. He was creating a map. Not just a map of creatures and locations and supernatural phenomena, but a map of the town's deeper nature. A map of what it means to live in a place where the rules are different, where the things you think you know about the physical world are suggestions rather than laws, where the line between the real and the unreal, between the permanent and the temporary, between the seen and the unseen, is drawn in a different place than everywhere else. Gravity Falls is a town where things that should be impossible are merely unusual, and the people who live there have adapted to that, in the same way that people adapt to anything they're born into. They know not to look too closely at certain things. They know which paths through the forest are safe and which aren't. They know not to ask too many questions about the gaps in their memory. They have built a life inside the weirdness, not despite it. And most of them, most of the time, are fine. They are ordinary people living in an extraordinary place, and the extraordinary place has become their ordinary. That is what the town is, at its core, and it's what makes it feel real even in its most fantastical moments. The weirdness is specific and local. It belongs to that valley. It has texture and history and consequences. It isn't just decoration, it is the place itself. Section 10. Weird Mageddon. When the pyramid fell, everything had been building toward this. Every cipher, every hidden message, every journal page, every memory that McGucket erased, and every secret that Stan kept, and every deal that Ford was manipulated into making, all of it had been pointing here, converging on this moment, funneling toward the single night in the summer of 2012 when Bill Cipher finally got what he had been working toward for 1 trillion years. The rift was a byproduct of the portal. When Stan reactivated the portal in the Season 2 episode Not What He Seems and Ford came through, the portal's reactivation didn't just bring Ford back, it created a dimensional rift. A small, glowing, unstable crack in the fabric of reality, small enough that Ford was able to contain it in a small glass orb and carry it around. But it was real. It was a physical crack between the physical world and the nightmare realm. And as long as it existed, if it ever broke or was broken deliberately, whatever was on the other side could come through. Ford spent the rest of Season 2 trying to contain the rift and find a way to seal it permanently while also dealing with the fact that Bill was still out there, still active in the mindscape, still aware of the rift's existence and presumably very interested in it. Bill had been making deals all summer, as he tells Dipper in a brief conversation, chatting with old friends, preparing for the big day. He had been putting pieces in place. He had been setting up what was coming. In the episode Dipper and Mabel versus the Future, Mabel is tricked. She is carrying the rift in the glass orb for safekeeping when a creature she encounters, which turns out to be one of Bill's agents, takes the orb from her under false pretenses. She doesn't understand what she's given up until it's too late. And when Bill gets the rift, he doesn't preserve it carefully. He smashes it against the ground. The sky above Gravity Falls cracks open like an egg. The episode Weird Mageddon Part 1 begins at that moment, with Bill Cipher finally gaining full physical form in the third dimension. His body burns into existence from the crack in the sky, flesh and metal and pure energy combining around the familiar triangle shape, scaling up until he is enormous, blazing, physically present in the world for the first time in his trillion-year existence. His first words, spoken at full volume to the assembled and absolutely terrified population of Gravity Falls, are essentially, "I am free." What follows is both an apocalypse and a party. Bill brings through the nightmare realm with him, opening the rift wide enough for his associates to tumble through. The Henchmaniacs, as they're collectively known, are a collection of interdimensional criminals and nightmare beings who were Bill's companions in the nightmare realm, each one genuinely singular in appearance and behavior. 8-Ball is a massive creature with a billiard ball for a head. Pyronica is a tall fuchsia figure with a flaming, fanged mouth where her face should be. Teeth is a large purple entity that is mostly just teeth. Hectorgon is a hexagon with a face. Keyhole is a skeleton with a keyhole for a chest. Kryptos is a cipher-covered cube. Its amorphous shape is exactly what the name suggests. Pacifier is a baby-shaped creature with a pacifier that fires actual laser beams. Xanthar, the least described but still distinctly threatening. These beings come through the rift and spread across Gravity Falls and immediately begin reshaping it. Gravity works in the wrong direction in random areas. Colors change without warning. Inanimate objects come to life and don't know what to do with themselves. The Gravity Falls. Lumberjack statue in the town square animates and begins wreaking havoc. The mayor's car starts driving itself. The local grill becomes self-aware. The rules stop working, and everything that was normal about the town dissolves in the weirdness wave that Bill radiates outward from the central crack in the sky. 3 days into Weird Mageddon, which is the time period when most of the finale episodes take place, Gravity Falls is unrecognizable. Bill has summoned the Pyramid, which rises from the center of town like a colossal red-brown pyramid with the top section floating separately above the base, glowing orange in the cracks between its stones. This is Bill's base of operations. His throne is inside it, and on his throne, as a grotesque kind of decorative backdrop, are the townspeople he has turned to stone as trophies. People frozen mid-expression, mid-sentence, mid-life, arranged decoratively around a throne built from petrified suffering. Bill sits on that throne and looks at his new domain and is genuinely, enthusiastically pleased with himself. But Weird Mageddon has a problem. Bill and his forces cannot leave Gravity Falls. A barrier exists around the town, generated by the natural law of weirdness magnetism, the same force that makes this particular valley special in the first place. The concentration of supernatural energy that brought Ford here, that made this place what it is also the thing containing Bill's chaos within town limits. He can destroy Gravity Falls completely, which would be bad enough, but he cannot spread beyond it. His plans for the world at large, his intended expansion across the galaxy and eventually the universe, are stalled by the same anomaly he used to access the physical world in the first place. The valley that let him in is also the cage. Ford knows the equation that would disable the barrier. That is the equation Bill needs. That is why Ford was turned to stone rather than simply killed. Bill needed Ford as a resource rather than a trophy. Needed the information in Ford's mind before he could move on to the next phase. And Ford, even as a statue, even in the grip of whatever terrifying experience being a statue during Weirdmageddon constituted, was refusing to give it. While this was happening at the pyramid, the rest of the main cast was scattered across the wasteland that Gravity Falls had become. Dipper and Wendy found each other in the ruins of the mall. The time police showed up at Bill's party to attempt to arrest him for his various violations of temporal law, led by Time Baby, who is exactly what the name suggests. An enormous, all-powerful baby made of time energy who is the last of a race of time giants that Bill may or may not have had something to do with eliminating previously. Bill vaporized them all immediately with Time Baby's particles. According to the end credits cipher for that episode, scheduled to reform in approximately the year 3012. In the same year that the town's magic mailbox had previously predicted the world would end. This is not a coincidence. This is Hirsch connecting dots across the entire mythology of the show with the specific joy of someone who has been planning this for years. The resistance assembled in the ruins of the Mystery Shack. This matters logistically because of the unicorn magic. Earlier in Season 2, in the episode The Last Mabelcorn, Mabel had gone on a quest to obtain unicorn hair for a protection spell that Ford needed. The spell, involving genuine unicorn hair, created a barrier around the Mystery Shack specifically that Bill's reality-warping powers could not penetrate. The shack was protected, and the resistance, us including Stan and Saz, and several townspeople and McGucket and Wendy and Dipper and eventually Mabel after her rescue from the bubble, gathered inside that protected space. McGucket's mechanical genius, still functional even after everything, became the solution to the tactical problem of how to approach the pyramid when Bill controlled the reality outside the shack. McGucket took the shack itself, building and all, and transformed it into an enormous fighting mech. The Shacktron, as it came to be called, was the Mystery Shack reconstructed as a giant robot, the taxidermied animals becoming weapons, the building itself becoming a fist. And because the unicorn magic was embedded in the structure of the Shacktron was immune to Bill's direct attacks. He couldn't touch it. He could watch it walk toward the pyramid, but he could not stop it. The plan was simple. The Shacktron attacks the pyramid and distracts Bill while a small team goes inside to rescue Ford. Because if they can get Ford out, Ford has the quantum destabilizer. He built it specifically for this purpose, a weapon powerful enough to destroy Bill's physical form. Get Ford out of the stone, get him the weapon, end Weirdmageddon. The plan mostly works. The Shacktron engages Bill and his henchmaniacs in what is genuinely one of the most spectacular action sequences in the show's run. Bill, furious at being unable to hurt the shack directly, directs his forces against it while Dipper and Mabel and the others move through the pyramid's interior, rescuing the petrified townspeople and finding Ford. They get him out. Ford is free. And then Ford tells them about the prophecy, about the wheel, about the only other known method of defeating Bill. The Bill Cipher Zodiac, the wheel from the opening credits, requires all of its symbolic representatives to stand in a circle and join hands in simultaneous unity, channeling their collective power against Bill while he is within the circle. Ford and Stan are both on the wheel. Dipper and Mabel are on the wheel. McGucket, Pacifica, Gideon, who has been released from prison by Weirdmageddon, and who has, somewhat to his own surprise, found something like integrity in the process. Wendy. All the people who the wheel had named since the very first episode. They assemble. All of them. In the open ground before the pyramid, in the middle of the apocalypse. They join hands. They begin. And then Stan and Ford start arguing. It is the most characteristic possible moment. The end of the world, every piece in place, the ritual underway, and the two brothers are still fighting about what happened all those decades ago in Glass Shard Beach. About the perpetual motion machine. About the years of silence and the accusations and the grudges that neither of them had ever fully laid down. And the argument is what breaks the circle. The moment of disunity is all Bill needs. He shatters the ritual, sends the Zodiac members flying, catches Dipper and Mabel, and makes his ultimatum. The equation for opening the barrier. Give it to him or the twins get it. And Ford, under that pressure, does what Ford always does under sufficient pressure. He prioritizes the big picture over the personal. He begins to consider giving Bill what he needs to let the twins go, because the strategic calculus says the twins are more important than the barrier. Because the twins are family, and family is the thing that can't be sacrificed. But it isn't Ford's choice. It was never going to be Ford's choice. It was always going to be Stan's. Section 11. The Zodiac, the Sacrifice, and the End of Summer. The twins had a plan. They must have discussed it somewhere in the chaos of the final battle, must have found a moment between the fighting and the rescue and the failed Zodiac ritual to think through what they knew and what might still work. Because when Bill closes in on Dipper and Mabel and makes his ultimatum, what happens next is not improvised. Ford and Stan switch clothes and switch. Yeah, this is the element of the plan that is so simple and so human that it feels almost out of place in the context of a cosmic battle between physical reality and a trillion-year-old dream demon. But Stan and Ford are identical twins. They share the same face, the same general build. The 6 fingers are Ford's distinguishing feature, but in the chaos of Weirdmageddon, in the dim glow of the pyramid interior, with Bill focused on extracting information rather than verifying identity, it is possible. It is barely possible. It requires perfect execution and a willingness to sacrifice something irreplaceable. Ford switches clothes with Stan. Stan becomes Stanford Pine's 6-fingered physicist, the person whose mind contains the equation Bill needs. Ford becomes Stanley, the con man in the background, but the ordinary older brother who has nothing in his head that Bill would want. And Stan approaches Bill and offers him the deal. I will shake your hand and you will read my mind and you will get the equation. And Bill, who has been playing the long game for 1 trillion years, but who has never been this close to what he wants and who is perhaps, in his moment of apparent triumph, less careful than he should be, shakes Stan's hand. He enters the mind he shook hands with and finds himself in the living room of the Mystery Shack. Not Ford's laboratory, not Ford's mind, full of physics equations and dimensional research and decades of hard-won knowledge. The living room of the Mystery Shack, Stan's mind. The home Stan had been living in for 30 years, the home he had built from Ford's abandoned research facility. That's the home that smelled of bad taxidermy and tourist trap products, and 30 years of nightly basement work, and the summer that 2 12-year-olds came and taught him what family felt like when you weren't carrying it alone. Stan is sitting in his chair, calm, waiting, not afraid. And he tells Bill, in the moment when Bill understands what has happened, that Bill made the fatal mistake of messing with his family. Outside, Ford raises the memory gun, aims it at his brother, and Stan nods. Bill immediately understands. His powers are useless in Stan's mind because Stan's mind is being erased from outside at the same moment Bill is inside it. The flames that consume Stan's memory begin to eat Bill too, because Bill is in Stan's mind, and if Stan's mind goes, Bill goes with it. Bill panics, he begs, but he offers everything he has ever offered anyone. Money and power and fame and the entire structure of reality, bent to Stan's preference, and Stan shrugs it off. He wasn't using that mind much anyway, he says. Nothing can stop it now. Bill Cipher, a being older than time, a creature of absolute power, who destroyed his own dimension and spent over 1 trillion years in the spaces between worlds scheming for physical form, who corrupted a brilliant man and tore apart a family and built a pyramid from the petrified bodies of innocent people and came within an arm's reach of spreading his chaos across the entire universe, comes apart inside the burning mind of a New Jersey con man who loved his family enough to let himself be erased. The moment Bill dies is rendered with unusual restraint for a show's villain death. He doesn't explode. He doesn't scream for long. He speaks backwards messages as he comes apart, broken speech that fans have isolated and reversed and found to be his final pleas and his final rage, and then he is gone. His physical body, the form he had finally obtained and reveled in, turns to stone where he left it, an inert triangle in the forest outside Gravity Falls. A statue, just a statue. Nothing about it seems dangerous anymore. It just sits in the trees. The pyramid dissolves. The henchmaniacs are pulled back through the rift into the nightmare realm. The rift seals. The crack in the sky closes, and Gravity Falls goes back to being Gravity Falls, with all its particular weirdness intact, but without the apocalyptic overlay. The gnomes are still there. The shapeshifter is presumably still in the bunker. The lake creature is still in the lake. So the anomalies that Ford spent 6 years documenting have not gone anywhere. They're just anomalies again rather than harbingers. Just the ordinary strangeness of an extraordinary place. Stan wakes up with nothing. No memories. No knowledge of the past, of Gravity Falls, of the twins, of the summer, of the 30 years he spent in a basement, of the brother he spent those 30 years trying to save. He is friendly and slightly confused, and fundamentally a stranger to the people looking at him with those faces full of grief. He doesn't know why they look at him that way. He doesn't know why the small girl with the star sweater looks like she might be sick with something. He doesn't know who he is to any of them. And then Waddles sits in his lap, and Stan's mouth shapes the word. The pig's name, Waddles, without knowing why. And Mabel's face changes. And Stan sees something in her face, something he can't name but can feel the shape of. And she starts showing him pictures, one by one. Things he doesn't remember, things he should remember. The memories don't come back all at once. They come back the way they went, in pieces, in fragments. Connections establishing themselves incrementally as Mabel moves through her scrapbook with the patience of someone who has always understood that some things take time. The summer fills back in around the edges of Stan's empty mind. Slowly, imperfectly. Not everything returns. Not everything ever returns when you've done what they had to do to stop Bill. But enough comes back. Enough for him to know his family. Enough for the summer to still be the summer it was. In the final episode's second half, titled Somewhere in the Woods in later airings, the series spends its last 20 minutes in a kind of gentle, generous exhale. The threat is over. Bill is gone. The world is intact. And now there is time for all the small human things that the plot had been crowding out. The birthday party, Stan and Ford leaving for their childhood dream, the Stano War II to sail around the world looking for more anomalies together. Sue's taking over the Mystery Shack, which promptly has its name changed to Saos's Mystery Shack. Gideon, having found something like integrity during Weirdmageddon, seemingly turning a corner. McGucket, having recovered his memories and his dignity, moving into Northwest Manor. Pacifica, having chosen herself over her family's legacy, moving forward. All these people whose lives the summer rearranged. And the twins, on the bus home at last. Together, turning 13. The last summer of childhood concluding in the rearview mirror of a bus moving through Oregon forest. Dipper opens Wendy's note. See you next summer. And the summer that follows, even if we never see it, even if the show was always going to end here, feels like it is going to be something worth having. Because they will all still be there. Because this place and these people are not going anywhere. Because the summer might end, but it doesn't disappear. The ending of Gravity Falls is one of the finest series finales in the history of animated television. It earns every emotion it asks for. It honors everything it built over 40 episodes. It is warm and slightly sad and fundamentally hopeful. And it understands that the job of an ending is not to resolve everything cleanly, but to leave the people you love in a place where you can believe in their future. And it does exactly that. Dipper and Mabel are going to be okay. More than okay. They are going to be magnificent, these two 12-year-olds who spent their last summer of childhood defeating an interdimensional dream demon with the help of their dysfunctional, loving, thoroughly unusual extended family, and who come out of it knowing something essential about who they are and who they belong to. What else could you ask for? Section 12. Legacy, the Cipher Hunt, and what it all means. Tja. The show ended on February 15th, 2016. The finale aired, the credits rolled, and the fans, who had been decoding cryptograms and building wikis and analyzing background details and contributing to a collective project of understanding this show for nearly 4 years, found themselves suddenly without new material to decode. The puzzle was complete, in theory. The story had been told. What remained? What remained was Alex Hirsch's last secret. 5 months after the finale, in July 2016, Hirsch posted something online. It was a coded string of text. And when the fans decoded it, what they found were the first clues in a global treasure hunt called the Cipher Hunt. The goal was simple to describe and complex to execute. Somewhere in the world, there was a life-size statue of Bill Cipher. The Cipher Hunt would lead participants through a series of clues to find it. The clues were scattered across multiple countries, and fans followed them to locations in the United States, Japan, and Russia, decoding messages at each location that led to the next. Over 2 weeks in the summer of 2016, what started as an online puzzle transformed into a genuine, real-world adventure, with teams of fans traveling internationally to follow clues that Hirsch had hidden in coordination with people around the world. It was the most elaborate extension of the show's interactive philosophy, taking the same spirit that had made the in-episode cryptogram so compelling and scaling it to the entire globe. The statue was found on August 2nd, 2016 in Reedsport, Oregon, a small town, pine trees, the Pacific Northwest. The Gravity Falls mythology brought physically into the world. The statue stood over 2 meters tall, cast in concrete, painted yellow, made to look exactly like the brief glimpse of the petrified Bill in the finale's closing shot. It had his hat. It had his eye. It was unmistakably and completely and wonderfully him, standing in a park in Oregon as if he had always been there. The day after it was found, local authorities had it removed due to a property dispute, but not before thousands of people had seen it. Not before the photographs had spread across the internet. The statue currently exists in storage somewhere, cared for by Fawn Davis, the sculptor who made it, waiting for a home that doesn't involve a property conflict. It is, as far as any public information goes, still intact. Bill Cipher, in physical form, is still out there. Waiting. The story didn't end with the statue. The tie-in media continued. While Gravity Falls, Journal 3 came out in July 2016 and became a New York Times bestseller for 47 weeks. Gravity Falls, Lost Legends, a collection of 4 news stories, came out in 2018. Dipper and Mabel and the Curse of the Time Pirate's Treasure came out alongside Journal 3. All of these materials expanded the world of the show without contradicting or diminishing it, adding new rooms to a house that was already substantial. They kept the show alive in the way that matters, as a living thing rather than a completed object, something that continued to have new things to discover rather than becoming purely archival. And then in 2024, The Book of Bill. The Book of Bill is the most recent major addition to the Gravity Falls mythology as of the time this script was written, and it is something genuinely unusual, and it is marketed as being for adults, not teenagers. Adults. It is published under Disney's Hyperion Avenue imprint, which is the brand they use for mature content. It is written in Bill's voice, which means it is deeply unreliable, frequently chaotic, occasionally genuinely disturbing, and somehow more charming than anything that description should make possible. It contains new lore. It contains Lost Journal 3 pages. It contains Bill's account of his origins and his time in the Nightmare Realm and his relationship with Ford and his reaction to being defeated. It also contains, according to persistent fan theory and some interpretive evidence within the text itself, the possibility that Bill is not as gone as the finale suggested. His physical form is stone. His presence in Stan's mind was erased. But the book exists somehow, and Bill is very pleased about that. The Book of Bill hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list immediately. As of recent reports, it has sold over 850,000 copies worldwide. Journal 3 has sold over 1.3 million copies. These are not small numbers. These are the numbers of an audience that genuinely loves something and wants more of it, that has not moved on and does not intend to move on, that is still here, still paying attention, still decoding. Gravity Falls will eventually turn 15 years old. That anniversary will pass and the fandom will still be there because the fandom for this show is not the kind that dissipates. It is the kind that deepens. The people who grew up with Gravity Falls are adults now. They are 20-something and 30-something. And they are rewatching the show and finding new things in it, seeing things that weren't visible to them at 12, and they are passing it to the people in their lives who haven't seen it yet, insisting softly on its importance. The fandom is not declining. If anything, it is expanding as a new generation of viewers finds the show through streaming and social media and the word-of-mouth tradition that has always been how the best things spread. There is a reason for this, and the reason is not just that the show was clever, or well-animated or funny, though it was all of those things. The reason is that Gravity Falls was made with genuine love and genuine conviction, and a genuine belief that its audience deserved honesty. Alex Hirsch has talked about this in various ways over the years, about how he wanted to make a show that trusted children to handle complicated things, that understood children were capable of engaging with genuine sadness and genuine moral complexity and genuine fear without needing those things filtered or softened or resolved too quickly, about how he was drawing on his own childhood, on the experiences that had actually mattered to him at 12 and 13, and how those experiences included things that were not comfortable. The end of summer. The feeling of a relationship changing. The discovery that the adults you trusted were carrying secrets you didn't know about. The recognition that some things could not be fixed or undone. And he wrapped all of that in comedy and adventure and monsters and codes, because that is how you make something that reaches people. You meet them where they are. That you give them the gnomes and the grumpy uncle and the sparkle sweaters and the funny cryptograms, and then slowly, carefully, you show them what else is there. The grief underneath the comedy, the loyalty underneath the dysfunction, the love underneath everything. Because in the end, what Gravity Falls is about, at the absolute core of all of it, underneath all the mysteries and the codes and the ancient dream demons and the interdimensional portals, is family. It is about two brothers who were separated by an accident of carelessness and spent 30 years paying for it, and who found their way back to each other. It is about two kids who found out that their beloved Grunkle had been lying to them all summer and chose to trust him anyway, because the evidence of who he was, the person he showed up as every single day, was louder than any lie. It is about a community of people in a strange place who formed connections, in the specific crucible of that strangeness, who were shaped by their weird town into something more than they would have been a somewhere ordinary. The mystery of Gravity Falls was always just the surface. The mystery was the lure, the code, the framework that let Hirsch tell you the actual story without announcing himself at the door. The actual story was always about people, about what people owe each other, about what love costs and what it builds, about the summer that changes everything, the summer you spend the rest of your life measuring other summers against. The show grew with you because it was designed to. And Hirsch built different layers into it specifically so that what you found in it at 12 was different from what you found at 16, different from what you found at 25. At 12, you see the monsters and the mystery. At 16, you see the growing up, the ending of summer, the grief of becoming someone new. At 25, you see the adult characters' failures and the ways those failures echo into the present and the cost of unresolved things. At 30, you see all of it at once. Every layer simultaneously, the comedy and the horror, the love and the damage, the hope and the loss. And you understand that what Hirsch built was not just a cartoon. It was a thing that would keep meaning more the longer you lived with it. Bill told Ford once that he was going to get everything he wanted, that he would tear this world apart and remake it in his image and liberate it from its own dreary consistency. Bill was wrong about many things, but he was most wrong about the thing that mattered most. He was wrong about what was worth having. He was wrong about freedom and liberation and the value of things that last. Because what lasted was not Bill's chaos. What lasted was the Mystery Shack. What lasted was Stan's 30 years of silent work in a basement. What lasted was the moment Mabel didn't press the button. What lasted was Dipper's note in his pocket, "See you next summer," already looking forward to the next thing, already planning to come back. Bill wanted to end the world. The Pines family saved it with love and stubbornness and a con man's trick and a pig's name remembered in the ruins of a wiped mind. That is a genuinely good story. That is a story that deserves to be told slowly and carefully and with full attention to everything it contains. And if you've made it here, if you've spent these hours with me in the pine trees and the fog, following the codes and the hidden eyes and the 30-year secrets, and the dream demon who never quite understood what he was up against, then I want to say something to you. Thank you. Really. Thank you for being the kind of person who shows up for something like this, who settles in and pays attention and lets the story have its full weight. The world is full of people who want everything faster and shorter and easier, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also something specific and irreplaceable about a person who will sit with a thing and let it take as long as it takes. That is, and incidentally, what Dipper Pines learned to do over the course of one summer in Gravity Falls. He learned to slow down. He learned to be where he was rather than always reaching for the next thing. He learned that the adventure was the summer itself, not what he was going to do after it. Take that with you, wherever you're going next. If you're still awake, thank you for your attention. It means more than you know. If you've already drifted off somewhere in the middle of all this, I hope the dreams are full of pine trees and hidden messages, and a familiar gruff voice calling a pig by name in the quiet of an ordinary morning. I hope the summer never quite ends. And if this video gave you something, if it was worth the time you spent with it, please leave a like. And share it with someone who loves this show or who has never seen it and needs to know it exists. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do. This community, the strange and lovely group of people who keep showing up for these long, slow dives into the things that matter, is something worth being part of. Join us. We'll be here, in the fog, in the pines, i.e., decoding whatever comes next. See you next summer. Good night. And remember, reality is an illusion. The universe is a hologram. Buy gold. Buy. There is a particular pleasure in tracing the mythology of Gravity Falls all the way back to its most foundational elements, to the things that existed in this valley before Ford arrived, before the town was founded, before any human presence complicated the landscape. Let's go there for a while. Let's think about Gravity Falls as a place before it was a place. The interdimensional anomaly that defines the valley has been there, presumably, since the crash that created the geographic formation itself. The UFO, or whatever the object was that impacted this specific stretch of Oregon mountainside tens of millions of years ago, altered the fabric of physical reality in a relatively small but precisely concentrated area. The alteration was not just topographic. The impact didn't just carve the valley. It changed the rules in the valley. The rules about what could and couldn't happen. The rules about what was possible. And those altered rules have been operating continuously ever since, independent of whether any person was present to observe them or document them or worry about them. The creatures of Gravity Falls are not invaders from another world. Not exactly. Some of them, like Bill's forces during Weirdmageddon, came through from outside. But most of the native wildlife of the valley, the gnomes, and the lake creature, and the pterodactyls in the bunker, and the shapeshifter, and the dozens of entities that Ford cataloged over 6 years, these are all native. They belong to this place, they evolved here, or were drawn here by the same anomaly that makes the place special, or have been here so long that the distinction between native and drawn doesn't meaningfully apply anymore. They are Gravity Falls the same way the pines are. Gravity Falls, and the waterfall is Gravity Falls. This matters because it means that the town was founded on and around a living ecosystem that was already deeply strange before a single human being settled there. Quentin Tremblay didn't create the weirdness when he founded the town. He founded a town inside the weirdness that was already there. The weirdness predates the town. The weirdness predates everything human in the valley. It is older than the town, and older than the road, and older than the mystery shack, and older than the portal, and older than Ford's research. It is, in that sense, the most permanent thing in the show. Bill can try to expand it and magnify it and make it catastrophic, but he didn't make it. He just wanted to use what was already there. The layers of the town's history, as the show reveals them piece by piece, go deeper than any single narrative can fully contain. There are indigenous stories about this land that the show acknowledges in the cave paintings and the warnings and the symbols that survived long enough for Ford to find them. There is Tremblay's founding and the subsequent political conspiracy to erase him from the record. There are the mining operations that stopped when miners started seeing things they couldn't explain. There is whatever happened in the decades between Tremblay and Ford's arrival, the slow accumulation of a town that built itself around the strangeness without fully understanding it, developing the particular local culture that made Gravity Falls the place it was when the twins arrived. The Society of the Blind Eye is, in this context, almost inevitable. Given that the weirdness is a permanent feature of the landscape, given that ordinary people living in and around it are going to encounter things they can't explain, given that the human mind is not well equipped to integrate genuinely impossible experiences into a functional daily worldview, some mechanism for managing that cognitive dissonance was going to emerge eventually. The Society was McGuckett's version of it. More organized and more dangerous than the informal version, which was probably just the collective agreement to not talk about certain things that most small towns in unusual locations develop naturally over time. But the impulse behind it was ancient and understandable and fundamentally human. Blind eyes. The things we choose not to see. The experiences we decide not to examine too closely. This is not only a theme of the Society's specific arc in Season 2, it is one of the show's foundational concerns. Stan choosing not to look at the evidence that he might be wrong to trust Bill. Ford choosing not to look at the evidence that his muse might have an agenda. McGuckett choosing not to look at what happened to him in the portal aperture. The show is, at its core, a sustained meditation on the cost of looking and the cost of not looking. Both things have wadas. The question is, which cost you can live with and which you cannot. Dipper is defined as a looker. The journal under his arm from day one, the desperate need to understand, the inability to let a mystery lie. This serves him enormously well as the summer progresses. It is also the thing that makes him occasionally dangerous to himself. Not the specific danger of someone who can look at things directly that might be better approached obliquely. The shapeshifter almost gets him because he keeps trying to verify directly rather than accepting the ambiguity. Bill almost gets him because he keeps engaging rather than retreating. His greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability are the same thing, as they tend to be with people who are genuinely themselves. Mabel, by contrast, is not primarily a looker. She is a feeler. She navigates through things by following her emotional center rather than her analytical mind. This makes her less likely to be manipulated by evidence that points the wrong way because she's not primarily reasoning from evidence. She's reasoning from her gut and her heart, and those faculties are harder to deceive than the rational mind. Bill can construct a logical argument that traps someone who reasons logically. He cannot do as much with someone who simply knows how they feel and trusts it. The bubble was effective on Mabel specifically because it didn't appeal to her reason. It appealed to her heart's most vulnerable desire. And even then, even in the most comfortable prison imaginable, she found her way out. Together they are, as the show keeps insisting, better than they are separately. Dipper's looking is better when Mabel is there to feel the truth of what they find. Mabel's feeling is better when Dipper is there to look at what the feelings are pointing at. This is not a novel observation about how complementary personalities can work well together. But the show earns it because it shows you the specific ways they are better together through the specific texture of specific events, rather than just asserting it. The town itself, all those people living inside the weirdness with various degrees of awareness and various coping mechanisms, forms a kind of ecosystem around the twins' summer. Everyone has a relationship to the strangeness of Gravity Falls. Everyone has a way of managing it, accepting it, denying it, studying it, fearing it, celebrating it. The town is not just a setting, it is a community of different approaches to the same fundamental situation. And the diversity of those approaches is part of what makes the show feel full. When Weirdmageddon hits and the town is stripped of all its ordinary defenses and exposed to the thing underneath the surface, what survives is the community. Not the buildings, not the rules, not the official structures. The fact that these specific people know each other, and have reasons to care about each other. The resistance that assembles in the Mystery Shack is not assembled by command. It assembles because the people who make it up have reasons to be there. Personal reasons. Reasons that come from the summer, and from the years before the summer, and from the specific texture of life in this particular strange place. The community is the defense. The shared investment in each other is what Bill couldn't replicate in his perfect-looking prison bubble or his throne made of petrified trophies. This is the final thing Gravity Falls is about, under everything else. Community. The way that belonging to specific people in a specific place creates a kind of strength that nothing cosmic or abstract can easily undo. Bill was never going to win because Bill fundamentally misunderstood what he was up against. He thought he was up against logic and knowledge and power. He was up against Mabel's scrapbook. He was up against a pig called Waddles and the muscle memory of a man's love for something he can't quite remember. He was up against 30 years of nightly work in a basement and a woman with rainbow braces who knew when to step back from a button. None of those things are powers in the supernatural sense. None of them appear on any inventory of abilities that would concern a trillion-year-old dream demon. And all of them together were exactly enough. That is the story of Gravity Falls. On a place where the rules are different, where reality is thinner, where the supernatural is as present as the pines. And the people who lived there, who loved it and feared it and documented it and tried to erase it and built their lives inside it, who were shaped by it in ways they didn't fully understand. And two kids who spent a summer finding out who they were in the most extraordinary possible setting. And a family that nearly broke and didn't. And a dream demon who finally lost. There is one more thing worth addressing before tonight is fully done, and it is something that lives outside the mythology proper, outside the lore and the codes and the timeline and the family backstory. It is something about what the show gave to the people who watched it, and what that means now, years after the finale aired. By Alex Hirsch, made Gravity Falls in an era when animated television for children was largely organized around a simple principle. Keep things light enough that parents don't object, and entertaining enough that children keep watching. There were exceptions, obviously, there have always been exceptions, but the default was reassuring and accessible and not particularly interested in challenging its audience. Gravity Falls was not interested in that at all. Gravity Falls was interested in the truth of things, including the uncomfortable truths, the ones about how adults fail children and how families carry damage through generations, and how the people you trust most can be keeping secrets that reshape the world you thought you knew. And it delivered those truths inside a story that was also genuinely funny, genuinely exciting, and genuinely warm. The difficulty of what Hirsch achieved is easy to overlook because the results feel natural. A show can be funny and heartbreaking. A show can be scary and comforting. A show can respect its audience enough to be honest with them while also loving them enough to make sure there's something to hold on to. These things do not have to be mutually exclusive. Gravity Falls proved that again and again, in episode after episode, from the pilot through the finale. There is a generation of people, roughly speaking the generation that was between 10 and 18 when Gravity Falls originally aired, from 2012 to 2016, who grew up with this show as part of their specific emotional vocabulary. Not just as a beloved piece of media, but as a formative framework. The show gave them language for certain kinds of experiences before those experiences arrived. It gave them a picture of what manipulation looks like in Bill's relationship with Ford, before they had encountered manipulative people in their own lives. It gave them a picture of what family loyalty looks like when everything is at stake, in Stan's 30 years of silent work before they fully understood what loyalty cost. It gave them a picture of what it means to grow up, in Mabel's journey through the summer before growing up felt as immediate as it would eventually feel. These are not small gifts. These are the kinds of gifts that last. The ones you don't notice fully until later, when you're in a situation that feels familiar for a reason you can't immediately place, and then you remember. That you remember the triangle demon and the scientist who trusted him too much. You remember the woman at the button who stepped back. You remember the man in the basement who never stopped working. Gravity Falls was a show that trusted its audience to grow. It trusted that the kids watching it would eventually become the adults who could look back and see the other layers. It trusted that the story it was telling at the surface, The fun summer adventure with gnomes and codes was not the only story it was telling, and that the other stories would find their audience when their audience was ready for them. That trust is rare. Most storytelling assumes an audience of a specific age and pitches itself to that age and stays there. Like Gravity Falls was pitched to 12-year-olds and also to the 16-year-olds they would become, and the 25-year-olds after that, and the 30-year-olds after that, simultaneously in the same 40 episodes, using layering and depth rather than multiple versions. If you are watching this as someone who has loved Gravity Falls for years and is returning to it for reasons you understand perfectly, then you know what I mean. If you are watching this as someone who is encountering the show for the first time through this video, please go watch it. Both seasons. The finale. The books if you can get them. The show will meet you wherever you are. That is what it does. That is what it was built to do. And if you are here tonight because you can't sleep, or because the hour is late and your mind won't quiet and you needed something to fill the space between thinking and dreaming, then I hope this helped. I hope the stories of the Pines family and the Dream Demon and the coded journals and the 30 years in the basement gave you something to rest inside and even for a little while. Something large enough and detailed enough that your own smaller things could take a breath and come back to you more gently in the morning. The fog is in the valley. The pines are all around. The waterfall is going the way it has always gone, in that particular beautiful place that doesn't exist and somehow feels more real than many places that do. We've been out here a long time tonight. Let's let the trees have the quiet back. A few last things. Because we are this close to the end, and there are a handful of details I want to make sure we carry with us before the night closes completely. Bill Cipher's statue still exists. The physical, concrete, 2-meter-tall statue that was found in Reedsport, Oregon in August 2016, at the end of the Cipher hunt is in storage. It has not been displayed publicly since it was removed from its temporary installation location by local authorities the day after it was discovered. It belongs, for archival purposes, to its sculptor, Fawn Davis. It is waiting for a permanent home. Somewhere out there in a storage unit or a workshop in some part of Oregon, there is a statue of Bill Cipher. The physical manifestation of the show's mythology, sitting in the dark, wearing his hat, staring at nothing with his one carved eye. If you know where he is, you know more than most people. He is not gone. He is just waiting. The Real World Journal. 3 special edition, limited to 10,000 copies, still turns up occasionally in used bookstores and online resale markets. The blacklight reveals things that the standard edition doesn't show. If you find one and you own a UV torch, the experience of holding that book and watching new text appear on pages you thought you'd already read is a genuinely unusual thing. It is, as close as any physical object can be, the experience of being Dipper finding the journal in the forest. The surprise of hidden information in a thing you thought you understood. The sense that the world has a layer you hadn't suspected. The show's influence on the animation landscape that followed it is not nothing. Other shows in the years after Gravity Falls made similar creative choices: long-form narrative arcs in children's animation, embedded codes and rewards for careful attention, stories that took their emotional content seriously rather than keeping everything light and disposable. The trend existed before Gravity Falls and would have continued without it, but the specific way Gravity Falls proved that these things could work, that children's animation could be dense and layered and still enormously popular, gave other creators a model and a permission structure. The show was not just itself. It was an argument for a kind of television that took its audience seriously. The credits of Gravity Falls, after the final episode aired, contained one last message: the last cryptogram. Decoded with the Visionaire cipher and the keyword from that episode, it said something simple and final and generous, something that functioned as both a goodbye and an invitation. The community that had spent 4 years decoding end credits messages gathered one last time to work through the final cipher, and what they found was the show signing off in its own specific language, the same language it had been using from episode 1, the language of hidden things made available to the patient and the curious and the loving, the language of trust in the audience. That is the legacy of Gravity Falls. Not the merchandise, not the franchise potential, not the viewership numbers or the awards won or the bestseller weeks accumulated. The legacy is the relationship it built with the people who watched it. A relationship of honesty and challenge and genuine regard. A relationship that said, I think you're smarter than you're being given credit for. I think you can handle more than you're usually offered. I think the truth is more interesting than the comfortable version, and I think you deserve the truth. The show ended. The summer ended. The mysteries are still there in the spaces between what was fully explained and what was left open for you to carry forward. The show trusts you with those spaces. It always did. Good night. Dream about pine trees and forgotten codes and the specific quality of light in a place where everything is possible.